Hello, my dear friends. They never expected the greatest military power in Europe to unravel in a single morning. What followed was a chain of confusion no report dared to fully describe, a collapse shaped by secrets buried under sand, smoke and silence, whispers from diaries, scattered commands, and frightened footsteps reveal a truth darker than the battlefield itself. Tonight, you will walk through those shadows as the German soldiers lived them. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If someone had wandered along the French coastline in the early months of 1944, they would have seen long stretches of fortifications standing against the wind and salt. The Germans believed this line, the Atlantic Wall, would be the barrier that secured their grip on Western Europe. Concrete bunkers sat low against the dunes, their grey surfaces blending with the morning fog. Observation points watched over the sea with a steady calm. From a distance, it looked like an unbreakable shield, a structure built with purpose and confidence. Troops moved along the walkways carrying tools, weapons, or sandbags, as if maintaining a wall that would never truly be tested. The beach, the cliffs, the fields behind them, all seemed firmly under control. The line of defence was not confined to Normandy. It stretched from Calais up to Norway and down to the Pyrenees, a massive project built over years. Along its length, soldiers stood guard in rotation, many of them weary after long stretches of service. They were spread thin, covering terrain far too wide for their numbers. Yet the impression from above, from reports and maps, was that Germany held a defensive power unmatched in the war. Commanders spoke of the terrain as if it had already decided the outcome. Normandy was listed as a sector of lesser concern, a place considered difficult for any large landing. The tides were wrong, the beaches unstable, the approach too wide. The idea that the Allies might choose this region seemed unnecessary to consider. Inside the bunkers, the air was damp and heavy. Maps hung on walls, marked with notes from previous inspections. Some soldiers passed the time repairing equipment while others stared at the sea for hours on end. They knew their positions, their firing arcs, their routines. The structure of the Atlantic Wall made them feel as if preparation alone could stop an invasion. Their officers repeated the belief that Calais remained the true prize. It was closer to Britain, more direct, more logical. Everything pointed to Calais, and soldiers repeated this theory to one another until it felt like the truth. The sense of certainty was not only military, it seeped into daily tasks, the way rations were delivered, the schedules set by commanders, the quiet evenings when the sea wind moved through the cracks in the concrete. Normandy seemed almost peaceful. Patrols walked the same routes each day, hearing only the sound of waves hitting the shore. Farms nearby continued their routines, fields turning green as spring approached. Soldiers sometimes helped locals carry supplies or repair fences. Life felt repetitive, steady, and predictable. That predictability made the confidence stronger. Rumours filtered through the ranks, carried by letters, newspapers, and idle talk. Some claimed the Allies were assembling huge armies in Britain, but others insisted it was only a show intended to confuse. News travelled slowly, mixed with exaggeration and misinterpretation. What most soldiers heard repeatedly was that Germany had planned for every possible landing. The Atlantic Wall had been shown in propaganda photographs as an engineering triumph. Its gun batteries were said to be powerful enough to tear apart incoming ships. Its bunkers were described as impenetrable. These claims became part of the daily environment, shaping thought even when unspoken. Commanders reviewing the coastline often noted small weaknesses, gaps in coverage, stretches of sand unguarded during low tide, and outdated weapons in some of the casemates. Yet these observations rarely brought urgency. Reinforcements were scarce, and the High Command remained convinced that Normandy was not the decisive battleground. Improvements were made slowly, almost reluctantly, as if preparing for a danger that would probably never come. Soldiers filled sandbags, repaired barbed wire, and checked ammunition, routine tasks that felt more symbolic than necessary. When inspection teams arrived, they focused on appearances, the angles of trenches, the alignment of anti-tank obstacles, and the cleanliness of supply rooms. Reports written afterward gave the impression of readiness and order. The truth, however, was more fragile. Many guns were old. Some concrete had cracked in the winter cold. Communication lines were unreliable, especially during storms. But within the system of belief that Normandy was safe, these weaknesses felt unimportant. There were details in a story already decided. The coastline itself carried an illusion of protection. Wide beaches stretched for kilometres, with flat sand that changed shape depending on the tide. To the Germans, this terrain looked like a natural barrier. They imagined that heavy landing craft would struggle to approach. They trusted that mines and obstacles would be more than enough to slow down any intruders. A sense of comfort settled over the region, dulling caution and quieting doubts. Even the local civilians, living under occupation, absorbed the atmosphere. They saw soldiers moving calmly, officers visiting farms or walking along village roads without urgency. When Allied aircraft passed overhead on reconnaissance missions, the Germans rarely reacted with alarm. They believed it was simply another part of the war, nothing that threatened this particular stretch of land. Normandy felt distant from the possibility of chaos. The soldiers stationed there came from different backgrounds, young men barely trained, veterans transferred after injuries, and conscripts from occupied territories. Their motives varied, but their daily routines merged into a collective rhythm. They patrolled, they cleaned their weapons, they shared food, they played cards. The war seemed far away, happening elsewhere. They were told they were guarding Europe's shield, yet it felt like guarding a quiet backyard. Officers held meetings where maps were spread across tables. Arrows marked predicted invasion points, and Calais always dominated the discussion. Beaches there were shorter, narrower, and closer to enemy territory. It was the logical landing site, a phrase repeated so often it became unquestioned doctrine. Normandy appeared in the margins, a footnote in strategic planning. This oversight echoed down through the chain of command and settled in the minds of the soldiers standing on the sand. The Atlantic Wall, though impressive in propaganda, was a patchwork of strengths and weaknesses in reality. Some sections were heavily fortified with concrete bunkers and artillery batteries. Others had only wooden stakes and thin minefields. But the unevenness was overlooked because the larger narrative offered comfort. A defence line stretching across an entire continent seemed invincible simply because of its scale. The German standing guard believed they were part of something too large to fail. In the early mornings, mist would rise from the sea, blurring the horizon. Soldiers leaning on the parapets watched the grey water roll. They breathed the cold air, convinced that the quietness was a sign of security rather than a warning. The idea that the invasion could come through this silence never crossed their minds with any seriousness. The landscape felt familiar, and familiarity breeds trust even in wartime. Their confidence was not arrogance on an individual level. It was the outcome of repeated messages, incomplete intelligence, and the natural human desire to believe in stability. They held on to the thought that danger would strike somewhere else. Normandy was a posting, not a battlefield. The truth that lay beneath this confidence was simple. The Germans guarding Normandy saw what they wanted to see. A coastline that looked calm, a wall that looked strong, a war that looked predictable. They lived within an illusion built on assumption, distance, and routine, unaware that this illusion would shatter all at once. The quiet certainty that shaped their days was more fragile than they realized. It hid cracks that had long been ignored, and far across the water, something was already forming in the darkness that would break the silence they trusted so much. The soldiers positioned along the French coastline lived within a rhythm that felt more like waiting than preparing. Their daily movements carried the heaviness of men who had already given too much to battles, fought far from these quiet beaches. Most of them belonged to infantry divisions worn thin by years of marching, retreating, and redeploying. They were not the armoured units praised in Germany's early victories. They were men whose strength had faded through time, assigned to watch a coastline that seemed peaceful enough to dull the urgency of war. Their uniforms told their stories before their words could. Threads frayed from long use, boots patched and repatched, buckles tarnished from weather and neglect. Many of them had been transferred repeatedly, pushed from front to front until they no longer expected rest. The weight of their rifles felt familiar but not reassuring. These weapons had followed them across borders and through winters, and though they still worked, the hands carrying them no longer held the same confidence. Among these soldiers stood men who were not German at all. They had been swept into service from Eastern Europe, caught in the tide of occupation and conscripted into an army that was never theirs. Their expressions carried a distant resignation. Orders were understood through gestures more often than language, and routines became their anchor because clarity rarely existed. They marched, stood guard, and took their place in the defences because there was nowhere else to go. The cold wind from the Atlantic brushed against faces that held no trace of conviction, only the quiet acceptance of another day. Equipment varied from one outpost to the next. Some positions held machine guns that still operated smoothly, while others relied on older models that jammed in damp air. Ammunition arrived in uneven quantities, the crates marked by different years and different factories, as though collected from whatever remained in storage. Communication wires hummed weakly during storms. Lanterns flickered at night with diminishing fuel. Every sign pointed to a system stretched thin, yet none of these details seemed to reach the higher voices that spoke confidently of a strong defensive line. Their living conditions were spare and cramped. Bunkers smelled of damp concrete and old metal. Some soldiers slept on wooden planks placed unevenly along the walls, while others used blankets that no longer held warmth. Supplies were rationed carefully. Food often arrived late or in reduced portions when rail transport faltered. Water tasted of rust from old pipes. These discomforts blended into the background of their days. They were endured quietly, not questioned, as if hardship belonged naturally to the routine. When patrols walked along the dunes, the coastline appeared calm enough to make danger seem hypothetical. The waves rolled gently, lifting and lowering with a steady rhythm. Seagulls circled overhead, searching for scraps near fishing boats that drifted close to the shore. The villages behind the dunes moved at their own pace. Farmers tended fields with worn tools. Children walked along dirt roads without fear of the soldiers stationed nearby. This softness in the landscape created a sense of stillness that settled over the men. It made the possibility of invasion feel remote, something that might happen elsewhere, to someone else. The officers overseeing these scattered troops did not share all of their concerns. Reports emphasized the calm. They spoke of formations holding steady, obstacles placed correctly, minefields aligned as planned. There was little mention of fatigue or shortages, and even less attention given to the divisions that existed within the ranks. Mixed units made coordination uneven. Miscommunication became frequent. Yet on paper, everything appeared functional. The illusion of preparedness shaped the expectations of those far from the coastline, who believed the Atlantic Wall represented a continuous and unified shield. Training exercises reflected the disparity between appearance and reality. Movements lacked sharpness. Commands were repeated because they were often misunderstood. Weapons were fired at set intervals, but the men handling them did so with mechanical obedience rather than confidence. Some of the Eastern European conscripts held their rifles as if waiting for instructions that never arrived. Others stared out over the sea with vacant eyes, their thoughts far from the duties assigned to them. The supply situation added another layer of quiet instability. Trucks carrying ammunition or food sometimes failed to arrive. Fuel shortages slowed transportation. Weather damaged deliveries before they reached storage points. The men learned to adapt, but each adaptation deepened the cracks already present. They had little faith in the promise of reinforcements, and even less faith in the idea of a quick, decisive response if a crisis emerged. Despite all this, the daily rhythm held steady. Morning inspections followed by cleaning weapons, followed by watching the same stretch of sea, followed by meals taken without urgency. The routine became a kind of shelter. It reassured the soldiers that life along the coast would remain unchanged, untouched by the larger war gathering in the distance. Their commanders spoke calmly, their duties remained familiar, and the horizon stayed empty. It was enough to make complacency feel like a reasonable state. The truth underlying their days was that these men were neither ready nor positioned to withstand a large-scale assault. They were fragments of different histories, different levels of training, and different loyalties. Their equipment was mismatched, their energy depleted, and their support unreliable. The calm around them did not mean safety, it meant unawareness. They believed they were guarding a coastline that would only ever need watching, never defending. They stood in a place where nothing seemed urgent, and that absence of urgency became the most dangerous illusion of all. Their presence along the coast projected an image of strength that their condition could not support. Beneath the routine lay vulnerabilities they could not see, and deeper within the command structure, plans were taking shape that would expose these weaknesses with a force none of them could have imagined. The High Command of Germany viewed the Atlantic coastline through maps, reports, and projections. But Erwin Rommel saw something different when he walked along the sand. He studied the terrain not as an abstract line on paper, but as a vulnerable edge where the sea met the land, a place where every small weakness could grow into disaster. The quiet beaches, the long stretches of dunes, and the open fields behind them did not comfort him the way they comforted others. He looked at the tide patterns, the softness of the sand, the width of the beaches during low water, and he knew that silence could not be trusted. To him, the stillness was not a sign of security, but a warning disguised as calm. Rommel believed that the only chance to stop an Allied landing was to strike the moment the soldiers stepped onto the shore. Once the invading force established itself inland, he knew the battle would turn hopeless. The Allies had overwhelming air power, superior logistics, and a limitless supply of men and equipment. Germany had none of these advantages anymore. Every day he inspected the defences. He carried this awareness with him. The concrete bunkers, the gun placements, and the minefields looked impressive from afar, yet he sensed their insufficiency. Germany's strength was shrinking, not growing, and every hour lost would widen the gap. His belief in a forward defence put him at odds with many within the High Command. Rundstedt, the older field marshal, viewed the situation differently. He trusted in the ability to gather armoured divisions inland and strike the Allies after they landed, believing mobility could overwhelm them, but mobility no longer belonged to Germany. Fuel shortages, damaged railways, and constant Allied air patrols had changed the reality. Rommel understood this change more clearly than most. He pushed for tanks to be positioned near the beaches, not miles away. He argued that a rapid counterattack would be impossible once Allied aircraft filled the sky, turning every road into a killing ground. His reasoning was grounded in observation rather than theory, but it collided with ideas formed long before the war reached this weakened stage. When Rommel met with officers along the coast, he noticed their fatigue, their outdated equipment, and their incomplete preparations. He saw the sandbags slipping out of place, the mines not yet buried, the trenches too shallow to withstand bombardment. He knew that time was running out. The men building these defences worked under uncertainty, following orders that often conflicted with one another. Some were instructed to fortify inland regions, others were told to reinforce the beaches. The inconsistency reflected the larger confusion within the chain of command. The source of that confusion lay in Berlin. Hitler insisted on controlling strategic decisions from afar, issuing directives that shifted with his moods and fears. He approved armoured divisions only after long delays, reluctant to commit them near the shoreline. His belief in holding territory at any cost clashed with Rommel's insistence on destroying the invasion before it spread. This tension stretched across every meeting, every plan, and every defensive adjustment. Officers received orders that lacked clarity, and changes arrived too late to matter. Rommel moved along the coastline with a growing sense of inevitability. Each position he visited, each conversation he had with local commanders, reinforced the same thought: the defences were not ready, and the leadership above him was divided. He warned repeatedly that the Atlantic wall was far from impenetrable. He pressed for reinforcements that did not come. He urged for decisions that were endlessly postponed. The coastline looked solid, only to those who wanted to believe in its strength. The soldiers who stood guard saw him as a figure of urgency amid routine. They noted how he examined every bunker, every trench, every obstacle. His presence reminded them that danger was closer than the calm horizon suggested. He spoke through his actions, tightening expectations, quietly demanding a level of readiness that the circumstances could not fully support. His understanding of the situation ran deeper than the maps in headquarters. He felt the weight of every weakness along the coastline, and he carried that weight as he tried to correct what he could. Yet the pressure from above continued to widen the divide. Rundstedt's belief in a centralized armoured reserve remained strong. Hitler's insistence on personal control overshadowed practical military needs. Rommel's warnings were noted but rarely acted upon. His vision of a defensive strategy built on immediate, decisive strikes at the shoreline existed alongside plans that assumed Germany still held the initiative it had lost long ago. What emerged was not a unified system but a fractured one. Orders conflicted. Priorities shifted. The infrastructure lagged behind the urgency of the moment. The coastline, already stretched thin, had to bear the weight of leadership divided by competing strategies. Rommel saw this division clearly. He sensed that the greatest danger was not just the enemy approaching from across the water, but the hesitation and indecision within his own command structure. He returned to the beaches again and again, searching for any sign that time remained. Yet each visit showed the same fragile reality. The preparations moved too slowly. The men were too few. The leadership is too uncertain. The stillness of the sea became harder for him to trust. He watched the waves and imagined how little resistance they would meet when the moment finally arrived. The arguments within the high command left the defences standing on uncertain ground. A deeper tension was quietly forming beneath their conflicting decisions. Something within that silent divide was already preparing to surface in a way none of them expected. Early morning stillness along the coast had become something the soldiers no longer questioned. Light crept slowly across sand and concrete, settling into the same familiar shapes that greeted them day after day. Mist hung low over the water, softening every outline and giving the landscape a sense of distance that felt almost protective. Lamps inside the bunkers glowed faintly, their weak light reflecting on damp walls where shadows shifted with every movement of air. This quiet hour held a kind of repetition that soothed even the most restless men. A sudden alarm cut through that calm with a sharpness that startled only briefly. Many who heard it reacted with the same steady indifference shaped by months of drills. Early warnings were not unusual, most carried no real urgency, and the expectation that this one would be the same settled quickly among the officers on duty. Routines had taught them that surprises rarely existed along this stretch of coastline. Their responses followed habit rather than instinct. Initial reports arrived in fragments. Some described shapes offshore, others mentioned aircraft sounds that were difficult to identify. Static swallowed parts of every message, leaving more questions than clarity. Officers tried to piece the information together but found no firm confirmation. Long periods of false alarms had eroded trust in first signals, creating a pause where swift action should have existed. Many waited for a second alert, something stronger than scattered observations filtering through unreliable lines. Outside, the shoreline still appeared untouched. Mist covered the horizon. Waves moved in steady patterns, unchanged by the distant events unfolding beyond sight. Soldiers stepping into the morning air glanced across the water without alarm. Years of routine had tied danger to visible signs, and visibility remained empty. Nothing in front of them suggested that a massive landing force was drawing closer with every passing moment. Inside the bunkers, men stirred slowly into their positions. Some adjusted their belts with the tired ease of people who had done the same motion countless times. Others rubbed sleep from their eyes, still settling into wakefulness. Equipment checks continued without urgency. Each action reflected the belief that nothing unusual was unfolding. No one moved with the decisiveness that a true alarm required. These early minutes drifted by in quiet motion, shaped more by habit than readiness. Communication across command posts offered little improvement. Messages seeking verification crossed paths with new observations that answered nothing. Officers waited for clearer signals from higher command, but those signals never came. Senior leaders hesitated to relay what they did not fully understand. Patterns of indecision expanded across the network, settling into every corner of the defense. Confidence in their own procedures had created a dangerous expectation that real danger would always announce itself loudly and clearly. Rommel's absence during these early hours deepened the uncertainty. He had travelled inland for meetings, leaving local commanders to interpret the situation without his sense of urgency. His frequent inspections had often pushed officers to look past routine, to recognise the coastline's fragile defences. Without him, the familiar calm reclaimed every thought. Commanders relied on assumptions formed long before this morning, assumptions that insisted Normandy was not the true target. More minutes passed. Soldiers remained in their slow, deliberate preparations, still convinced they were responding to another exercise. Some stared through narrow bunker openings at a horizon that seemed unchanged. Others paced along the trenches, watching their surroundings with a detached focus. No sign before them contradicted their expectations. Inside this bubble of familiarity, danger felt distant, almost theoretical. Only faint hints suggested what was truly happening. A deep vibration under the sound of the wind, a subtle shift in the rhythm of the waves, slight movement within the mist far out at sea. Small details that might have held meaning for a more alert force slipped past unnoticed. The coastline remained wrapped in a quiet that concealed both vulnerability and approaching destruction. Reality outside this narrow field of perception had already shifted. Ships advanced toward the beaches. Aircraft circled overhead, preparing for coordinated strikes. Paratroopers descended inland, scattering across fields and villages. Yet those stationed along the coast continued operating within the shell of their routines. The first essential moments of response slipped through their fingers as hesitation grew heavier. Confusion expanded inside command rooms. Officers looked over maps without understanding how quickly the situation was changing. Reports from different sectors contradicted one another. Some tried to raise an alarm, but their voices lacked the clarity necessary to move reinforcements. Decisions waited for orders that required more certainty. Certainty never came. Every second of hesitation opened wider gaps in the defensive line. Armoured units remained inactive. Reserve forces waited for instructions that stayed suspended in discussion. A system built on a rigid hierarchy could not adapt to the suddenness of what was unfolding offshore. Habit and disbelief held back the initial reaction as firmly as any physical barrier. By the time subtle signs gave way to undeniable movement, the advantage of early response had already disappeared. Soldiers began to see faint shapes in the shifting mist, but these shapes appeared much later than they should have. What might have been recognized instantly in a more alert state took far longer to understand here, within a force trained to distrust its own alarms. Hesitation shaped those first critical moments in ways that could never be undone. A thin layer of disbelief separated awareness from action. A force far beyond their expectations was already pressing toward the shoreline, waiting to reveal itself without warning. Long before the invasion began, Certainty had already formed deep within the German command. Maps were spread out, routes calculated, distances measured, and in every conclusion, the same point emerged again and again. Calais was the narrowest stretch of water between Britain and the continent. Its proximity made it seem practical, almost inevitable. Officers repeated this belief so frequently that it settled into every layer of military planning, taking on the weight of truth rather than assumption. Normandy barely appeared in these discussions, not as a serious threat but as a distant coastline too far from Britain to attract a massive landing force. Within headquarters, confidence in this assessment shaped every decision. Reports circulated reinforcing the idea that Calais held the highest probability. Reconnaissance photographs showed increased Allied activity opposite that region. Patterns of aircraft movement seemed consistent with preparations for a concentrated assault there. The information, although selective, aligned neatly with what leadership already wished to believe. That convenience made it stronger than any data suggesting alternative possibilities. Patton's Phantom Army added another layer to this conviction. Inflatable tanks positioned in open fields, wooden aircraft resting on makeshift runways, and staged movements across the English countryside created an image of overwhelming strength gathering for a strike on Calais. These displays, captured by German intelligence, fit too perfectly into the narrative already accepted. Even the most cautious analysts found little reason to challenge what appeared so clearly before them. Illusion merged with expectation until the difference between the two no longer mattered. Information from agents or intercepted communications rarely contradicted this belief. When hints surfaced about activity near other coastal regions, they were filtered through the dominant assumption and dismissed as distraction tactics. The Germans expected deception, and therefore assumed any evidence pointing away from Calais was part of that deception. Normandy, with its wider beaches, unpredictable tides, and greater distance from Britain, remained far from their immediate concern. Its challenges were treated as natural barriers that made an Allied landing there unlikely. Along the Normandy coastline, soldiers lived inside this strategic belief without questioning it. They prepared their defences with diligence but without urgency. The idea that an invasion might come directly toward them seemed so far removed from what they had been told that it hardly influenced their state of mind. Their tasks revolved around maintaining equipment, watching the sea, and reinforcing positions. But not because they expected to face the decisive battle. Their mindset echoed the confidence of the command above them. Calais would bear the weight of any assault, not their quiet stretch of sand. Meetings held among higher-ranking officers reflected the same alignment. Charts pointed to Calais with arrows marking potential thrusts. Normandy existed on the edges of these maps, noted only as an area to observe, not one that required strong reinforcements. Rommel's warnings that the entire coastline was vulnerable created brief moments of tension, but those warnings clashed with months of intelligence reports pointing elsewhere. The pressure to believe in a single, predictable target overpowered any call for broader caution. Even during the final days before the invasion, when Allied bombings intensified and unusual movements were detected across the Channel, the established expectation remained intact. Some officers noted inconsistencies, but those inconsistencies were overshadowed by the clarity of the earlier narrative. The Germans saw what they expected to see. The possibility of Normandy emerging as the true landing site felt too far from the framework they had constructed, a detail too discordant to fit into the broader picture. This unshakable belief shaped the allocation of resources. Troops were positioned heavily around Calais. Armoured divisions remained farther inland in areas intended to support that region. Fuel reserves, transport units, and communication infrastructure centred around preparations for defending what they assumed was the most logical entry point for the Allies. Normandy, by comparison, received only what was deemed necessary for maintaining structural defence. No one imagined its defences would need to withstand the weight of a full-scale assault. As dawn approached on the day of the invasion, the Germans continued to operate within this framework of certainty. Messages reporting unusual activity near Normandy were interpreted through the same lens that had guided them for months. Officers looked at those early signals with doubt rather than alarm. Conflicting reports were blamed on weather interference or misidentification. The pattern of disbelief strengthened itself in each passing minute. By the time the truth began to surface, the chance to respond effectively had already slipped away. Normandy's distance from Britain, once considered a clear deterrent, became irrelevant in the face of the Allied fleet that advanced through the mist. The natural obstacles that had been cited as reasons to disregard this area offered little resistance to a force prepared with overwhelming coordination. The assumptions held by the German command, built over months of analysis and reinforced by layers of deception, left the coastline exposed in ways few had anticipated. Belief in a single target created blindness that shaped every layer of preparation. Certainty had settled so deeply that even clear signs struggled to break through. Realization heavier than anything they had imagined was already descending upon the coastline, waiting to overturn their most trusted assumptions. Once the first blasts reached the shoreline, the defences that had seemed fixed in place began to reveal their hidden fragility. Smoke drifted through trenches that had always felt too narrow, settling into corners where soldiers tried to understand what was unfolding beyond sight. Morning light struggled to cut through dust and debris hanging in the air. Each vibration of a distant impact spread through the ground, carrying an uneasy message that something immense had arrived before many were ready to face it. Communication lines, stretched thin across command posts, faltered almost immediately. Wires that had survived storms now failed under bombardment. Signals meant to guide movements dissolved into static. Officers waiting for updates lifted receivers only to hear empty noise, leaving them without direction in moments when direction mattered most. Runners sent between positions found paths torn apart by explosions. Messages that might have provided structure never reached their destinations, disappearing into the disjointed terrain left behind by the first waves of fire. Within the frontline positions, soldiers attempted to orient themselves in conditions that shifted faster than they could respond. Trenches shook under the force of naval shells, dust-coated uniforms, weapons, and faces until everyone carried the same pale mask of confusion. Men pressed against bunker walls, feeling concrete tremble under impacts it had not been built to withstand. The structure of their defence, once laid out in lines and angles on maps, shrank into fragmented pockets of isolated effort. Infantry units positioned closest to the shore took the earliest hits. Bombs landed with irregular force, spewing sand and shattered fragments across positions meant to hold firm. Machine gun nests that had always felt secure turned into cramped pockets of fear as their openings lit up with bursts of incoming fire. Even when soldiers tried to return fire, their movements lacked coordination. Without updated orders, each position acted on instinct rather than strategy. Moments passed with no knowledge of whether allies nearby were holding, retreating, or already buried under the weight of the assault. Naval bombardment pounded the coastline with an unbroken rhythm. Shells carved holes through defensive lines, lifting entire sections of trench systems into clouds of debris. Waves of pressure hit soldiers from all directions, disorienting them with sound and weight that exceeded anything they had trained for. The ground itself shifted under them. Tools, helmets, and weapons were scattered across trenches, mixing with dirt and broken timber. Nothing stayed where it belonged. Attempts to regroup met with physical and structural barriers. Paths between positions vanished under collapsed earth. Smoke obscured landmarks that had served as navigational points. Even officers who knew the terrain intimately found themselves disoriented, unable to locate units that had once been within calling distance. Shouts carried little meaning through the roar of bombardment, swallowed by explosions that came too quickly to distinguish their sources. Inside the bunkers, the air thickened with dust and the metallic smell of ruptured equipment. Men listened for instructions that never came. Maps, once spread carefully across tables, slid to the floor as tremors shook the structures. Lanterns flickered with each blast, casting shifting shadows that blurred the edges of panic. Officers attempted to assign directions, but with information cut off, their orders became guesses shaped more by desperation than design. Infantrymen pushed themselves back into firing positions, yet each attempt to resist met with overwhelming force. Naval guns tore through lines that had taken months to build. Mortars landed with frightening precision. The soldiers firing back did so in fragments, unaware of movements beyond the narrow slice of shoreline they could see through openings in the concrete. Every action they took felt too small for the scale of destruction unfolding around them. As the minutes passed, the sense of disconnection grew heavier. Units that had trained together now existed in isolation, their efforts scattered across ruptured terrain. No one knew whether the positions behind them remained intact or if reinforcements were even moving. Some believed help was approaching. Others sensed the truth that without communication, coordination had dissolved into broken pieces. Visibility dropped as smoke thickened across the coastline. The air pulsed with heat from each explosion. Sand, dust, and fragments of shattered defences created layers of obscurity. Soldiers moved through this haze with uncertain steps, aware that every moment carried more danger than guidance. The coastline that had once felt steady under their boots now shifted with each new impact. Bombs falling deeper inland severed what little structure remained. The outlines of trenches disappeared under debris. Bunkers lost entrances. Paths meant for retreat or reinforcement crumbled into uneven pits. Soldiers who tried to advance found themselves trapped by collapsed sections. Others attempting to hold their ground found only loose pockets of resistance around them. Each isolated effort weakened further under the strain of relentless bombardment. By the time the scale of the attack began to settle into their understanding, the network of frontline units had already fractured. Coordination had evaporated. Communication had disintegrated. What remained were clusters of men surrounded by noise, dust, and disorientation, fighting without the structure that had been intended to guide them. The vitality of the first line of defense faded into scattered resistance shaped more by instinct than command. Disorder tightened its hold on every corner of the front line, turning structure into fragments. Silence between positions grew wider than any physical gap. Forces advancing toward the shore were already preparing to step into this broken landscape, where resistance no longer resembled anything planned. Throughout the early hours of the invasion, messages rose through the layers of command with growing urgency, yet the system responsible for turning those messages into decisions moved with a weight that felt immovable. Reports describing bombardment along the coastline reached headquarters, but each update was examined, reconsidered, and softened by hesitation. Officers looked over maps, compared signals, and waited for confirmation that matched their expectations rather than the reality forming across the shoreline. Uncertainty clung to these rooms like a fog, thick enough to obscure what should have been clear. Within the high command, the absence of permission defined every action. Hitler maintained personal authority over armoured divisions, treating them not as tools to deploy when needed, but as pieces to guard tightly until the exact moment he chose to act. Officers who recognized the urgency emerging from the coast found themselves limited by this structure. No movement could begin without authorization from above. No reinforcements could shift position until orders passed through channels already burdened by conflicting signals and broken communication lines. This restriction shaped the morning into long stretches of inactivity. Those in the command posts were trained to wait for instructions, not to initiate bold actions on instinct. Every decision carried risk. Orders given without approval could lead to punishment, demotion, or suspicion. Even those who sensed the magnitude of the unfolding crisis held back, bound by layers of responsibility that discouraged independent action. Hours passed while officers reviewed the same maps, listening to fragmented updates that hinted at disaster but provided no single, unifying picture. The weight of indecision became heavier than the reports arriving from the coastal defences. Armoured divisions remained positioned inland, engines silent, crews waiting for movement that never came. These units had been trained for rapid deployment, but rapid deployment was impossible under constraints that reduced mobility to theory rather than action. Tanks sat in rows along fields and roads, their tracks collecting morning dew instead of churning the ground toward Normandy. Soldiers moved around them with restless steps, aware of the distant rumbling coming from the coast but unable to influence anything. Each minute of stillness deepened the gap between need and response. Inside headquarters, the mood shifted from confusion to unease. Reports that had seemed uncertain now grew more consistent, painting a picture that no longer aligned with earlier beliefs. Yet even then, hesitation persisted. Officers questioned whether the attack on Normandy represented the true invasion or a diversion intended to draw forces away from Calais. That doubt, rooted in months of preparation built upon faulty assumptions, made every decision feel precarious. The fear of committing too soon weighed as heavily as the fear of acting too late. Hitler's control created an environment where initiative withered. Hours after the invasion began, he still withheld permission to deploy armoured units. Officers closest to him lacked the authority to override this decision. Those further down the chain lacked the confidence to even attempt it. Everything depended on a single approval that did not come until midday, long after the momentum of the invasion had established itself. The coastline had already been reshaped by bombardment, troop landings, and fractured defences. The window for effective counterattack had narrowed to a sliver. By the time armoured units received permission to move, the conditions needed for swift deployment had already deteriorated. Roads jammed with damaged vehicles, fleeing civilians, and scattered equipment formed natural choke points. Smoke from bombardment drifted across fields, reducing visibility. Bridges had been destroyed by earlier air raids, limiting routes and forcing tanks into detours that cost more time. Each obstacle reinforced the sense that momentum had shifted permanently toward the invading forces before German units even began their approach. Meanwhile, frontline soldiers continued to resist with whatever strength they had left. They fought without knowing whether reinforcements were moving, whether command understood their situation, or whether their efforts still fit into any meaningful defence. Across bunkers and trenches, the absence of armoured support became painfully clear. Those who survived the early waves sensed that the broader system meant to support them was too entangled in caution and centralisation to respond in time. Their isolation deepened as hours passed without relief. As midday approached, the disconnection between need and action transformed into an irreversible setback. Tanks finally rumbled to life, but the time lost had diminished their impact before a single unit reached the coast. Command posts issued new orders with urgency, yet urgency came too late to offset the early paralysis that had shaped the morning. The weight of those delayed choices settled over the entire defence, turning opportunities that once seemed possible into distant notions that could no longer be reached. The coastline continued to shift under the pressure of Allied landings while the High Command confronted the consequences of its hesitation. Plans that had seemed logical on paper crumbled under the reality of time lost. Confidence dissolved into quiet acknowledgement that the morning's delays had changed the course of the battle. Those inside headquarters could only watch the reports accumulate, carrying updates that reflected a situation already moving beyond their grasp. Hesitation held the centre of command in a grip stronger than any incoming fire, turning hours into lost ground. Silence stretched between intention and action until momentum slipped away completely. Movements pushing inland were already taking shape within the shadows of uncertainty, preparing to reveal how deeply the morning's delays had altered the unfolding battle. Light had barely formed along the horizon when distant shapes began to emerge from the morning haze. At first, they looked like shadows drifting across the water, too numerous and too uniform to match any ordinary sight. Soldiers along the coast narrowed their eyes, trying to understand what approached through the mist. Waves rolled against sand with a steady rhythm, yet the motion beyond the shoreline carried a different weight, a weight that felt unnatural in its scale. What had been a quiet sea only hours earlier now stretched into an expanse filled with outlines no one had expected to witness. As clarity increased, the view turned heavier. Shapes multiplied until the line between water and metal blurred into a solid mass extending across the channel. Battleships, transport vessels, landing craft, and countless smaller silhouettes formed an immense wall that moved with a purpose nothing in the German defences had been built to absorb. Soldiers stared without speaking, eyes widened, not in recognition but in disbelief. The sea looked as if it had transformed into an endless procession, engineered solely for destruction. No report from intelligence, no exercise, no past engagement had prepared them for the sight expanding before them. Training had taught them to anticipate large movements, but this exceeded anything they had held in their imagination. Rows of landing craft moved with steady progression. Larger vessels remained behind them, their outlines sharp despite the drifting smoke. The scale felt overwhelming before the first shell had even landed. Many watched with an expression that mixed shock with resignation, as if their bodies recognized the truth before their minds accepted it. Tension along defensive positions tightened. Men gripped their weapons with hands that trembled from the magnitude of what approached rather than from cold. Officers attempted to study the formation but found little comfort in the analysis. Everything stretched too far across the horizon. Each glance revealed more vessels materializing from the mist, adding layers to a fleet that already seemed impossible to count. Movements on the water grew more precise with every passing moment. The invasion was not approaching, it was already present, filling the space between sea and sky. Within bunkers and trenches, soldiers leaned toward narrow openings carved into concrete. Their view framed only a small portion of the incoming armada, yet even that fraction felt larger than any full-scale assault they had been told to expect. Faces inside those confined positions carried pale expressions, drained not by injury, but by sudden awareness. Breathing slowed, hearts pressed harder inside ribs. Nothing in their preparation had included the possibility of an enemy arriving with such overwhelming reach, stretching from edge to edge of the coast. The stillness on land contrasted sharply with the restless movement upon the water. Soldiers scanned the horizon for natural limits to the fleet, but none revealed themselves. The sea kept giving shape to more silhouettes, each joining the collective advance. Young conscripts, positioned closest to the shore, struggled to maintain composure. Their training felt distant, overshadowed by the enormity of what now confronted them. Some lowered their gaze for moments, attempting to steady their breathing, only to raise their eyes again and find the horizon even more crowded. Within minutes, the fleet began forming patterns that left no doubt about its intention. Lines shifted, smaller craft pushed forward, larger ships positioned themselves for bombardment. German soldiers watched the transitions without fully grasping how quickly the balance of the morning had changed. The quiet air that had lingered before dawn now held vibrations from engines too numerous to identify. Dust along the trenches stirred. Though nothing on land had moved yet, soldiers sensed pressure building before any explosion shook the ground. Younger troops struggled most visibly. Their faces revealed an emotional collapse that training had never addressed. Eyes glistened with confusion. Muscles tightened along jaws. Some leaned against the bunker walls to steady themselves. The realization that they were witnessing the beginning of something immense placed a weight on their minds that no routine duty had prepared them to bear. What lay beyond the water felt less like an attack, and more like an entire world being pushed toward them, leaving no space for confidence or familiarity. Officers attempted to maintain structure, but structure weakened under the sheer magnitude of what confronted them. Orders felt too small in comparison to what unfolded across the sea. Even experienced soldiers struggled to process the scale. The coastline had transformed from a defensive line into a front facing an overwhelming mass that moved with steady purpose. Every sense sharpened, yet clarity brought no comfort. The invasion had not only arrived, but it had arrived in numbers that defied reason. Explosions had not yet touched the sand, Yet fear travelled through the ranks with silent efficiency. Many soldiers felt time compressing around them, as if each second carried more weight than the last. They braced themselves behind defences that suddenly felt thin, almost symbolic. Concrete that once appeared strong looked fragile under the shadow of the approaching fleet. Sandbags seemed inadequate. Mines and obstacles scattered across the beaches no longer looked capable of slowing what advanced toward them. Silence among the defending troops deepened. No one turned away from the sea. Eyes remained fixed on the movement offshore, even when muscles fatigued. The coastline held its breath. Morning light continued to rise, revealing even more of the fleet's formation. Each detail sharpened the sense of inevitability. Soldiers understood that whatever happened next would surpass anything they had endured before. The sea no longer felt distant. It felt as though it was pushing directly into their positions. Shock spread through the coastal defences long before the first shells fell, shaping the morning into a moment defined by disbelief. Breath tightened across the trenches as soldiers faced an image larger than any preparation. What began on the water was already closing in with a momentum that would soon press directly into their positions. When the first landing craft neared the shoreline, every defensive position along the coast braced for impact. German soldiers had spent months reinforcing bunkers, clearing fields of fire, and rehearsing the steps they believed would hold steady under pressure. Yet the reality unfolding before them carried far more weight than any drill. Morning light revealed incoming silhouettes pressing toward the sand with relentless persistence. Within seconds, the stillness that had carried through early dawn fractured into noise, pressure, and movement. Machine gun crews inside concrete fortifications prepared their weapons with the urgency of habit. Fingers tightened on triggers. Ammunition belts settled into place. Gunners directed their sights toward the water, where lines of landing craft advanced with unwavering formation. When the first ramp dropped into the surf, bursts of fire erupted from the bunkers, streaking across the rising tide, tracers cut through smoke drifting low along the water's surface. Soldiers inside the fortifications focused on maintaining steady fire despite the trembling of the concrete around them. Yet the effort to stop the approach confronted immediate limitations. Ammunition supplies were uneven, with some positions lacking the reserves needed for prolonged engagement. Weapons that had been maintained carefully faltered under the strain of rapid fire. Heat built inside barrels, reducing accuracy. Dust mixed with oil along moving parts, creating resistance that slowed mechanisms. Each malfunction forced gunners to pause and reset, losing precious seconds while the incoming waves closed in with growing determination. Naval bombardment crashed into the defensive line with crushing precision. Explosions carved openings through sand and reinforced concrete, lifting entire sections of earth into the air. Thick smoke rolled across the bunkers, obscuring visibility and filling narrow interiors with choking residue. Soldiers pressed themselves deeper into confined spaces as shock waves pulsed through the walls. Equipment rattled. Steel supports groaned. Dust shook loose from ceilings and settled onto uniforms until everything inside took on a muted, grey film. The strength of each defensive position varied by location, but many shared the same fate. Well-constructed bunkers absorbed early impacts before cracking under repeated strikes. Lighter emplacements collapsed within minutes. Machine gun nests built from sandbags and timber disintegrated almost instantly, leaving crews exposed. Soldiers who survived the first barrages found themselves lying among shattered debris, clinging to whatever cover remained as more shells struck the coastline. Infantry positioned closer to the open beach attempted to support the defensive fire. They moved through trenches carved into sand, raising rifles toward distant shapes that barely emerged through drifting haze. Waves of bullets reached the incoming troops, but could not halt the overwhelming numbers pushing forward. Each shot felt small within the vastness of the assault. The shore was filled with noise that drowned every individual effort. Sand kicked upward with each impact, layering itself over helmets and equipment until everything blended with the surroundings. Communication between positions collapsed almost immediately. Wires that connected bunkers snapped under explosions. Runners dispatched to carry messages never returned, their routes cut off by debris and shrapnel. Officers inside command posts waited for updates that no longer arrived. Without coordinated direction, each defensive point became an isolated pocket of resistance. Soldiers fought within narrow circles of awareness, never knowing whether neighbouring units were still holding or whether entire sections of the line had already vanished under bombardment. Within some bunkers, crews attempted to reposition heavier weapons, but limitations grew obvious. Mortars lacked the firing arcs needed for targets so close to the shoreline. Artillery placed further inland struggled to locate landing craft through the smoke drifting along the water. Fire missions lacked precision. Shells landed too short or too far, scattering impacts across empty sections of sand rather than striking the clustered waves of approaching troops. Crews worked tirelessly, yet felt the weight of inefficiency pressing onto their movements. The noise of the battle created an atmosphere that blurred time. Minutes stretched under the strain of constant vibration. Each explosion felt connected to the next, merging into an unbroken sequence that wore down focus and endurance. Heat-filled bunkers despite the morning's early chill, trapping soldiers in cramped positions where air grew thin. Sweat mixed with dust, forming streaks across faces pressed close to weapon sights. Breathing became shallow, concentration faltered, yet the incoming waves kept advancing. On sections of the beach where the first landing craft reached the waterline, German fire met determined resistance. Troops stepping onto the sand took heavy losses, but more arrived behind them. Lines thickened, smoke shifted, shapes multiplied. German defenders saw movement spreading across the beach with unsettling speed. Every impact on the water seemed replaced by another craft pushing forward. Defensive gaps widened. Some sectors found themselves flanked before realizing their neighbors could no longer hold their positions. As landing troops gained footholds on the beach, pressure on the defenders increased from multiple angles. Fire from inland positions attempted to support the front, but smoke and debris reduced visibility. Soldiers within bunkers felt vibrations from footsteps hitting the upper surfaces. Sand trickled through cracks. Metal supports trembled. The sound of conflict shifted from distant thunder to muffled thuds pressing directly against the walls. The perimeter of each fortification shrank as attackers moved closer with each passing moment. By midday, many defensive positions had transformed into remnants of their original structures. Concrete lay broken across the sand. Entrances collapsed under layers of debris. Gun barrels bent from heat or damage. Survivors who remained at their posts did so through instinct rather than strategy, operating within fragments of the defences that once seemed immovable. The coastline no longer resembled a fortified line. It had become a landscape shaped by destruction, exhaustion, and the relentless push of incoming waves. Resistance on the beaches dissolved under pressure that grew heavier with each landing craft touching the shore. Every bunker that fell left silence where coordinated fire once held the line. Movements rising from the surf were preparing to push inland through terrain reshaped by those first brutal hours. In the early hours of the invasion, messages spread through the rear lines describing the chaos forming along the beaches. Units positioned inland received brief fragments through damaged communication channels, each hinting at trouble but revealing little detail. Officers attempted to interpret the updates while examining maps covered with red markings, trying to determine which routes remained usable. Noise from distant bombardment carried faint echoes through open fields, yet the pathways that should have delivered reinforcements had already begun to fail long before the first landing craft touched the sand. Rail networks formed the backbone of German mobility across France, but air raids in previous days had struck these lines with precision. Bridges lay twisted along riverbanks, rail beds sagged under craters, and switching stations sat buried under debris. Trains that had once carried troops with reliable speed now sat frozen on broken tracks. Engines remained cold, Carriages rested in silent rows with wheels partially buried in rubble. Even when crews attempted to repair damaged sections, each attempt fell apart under the scale of destruction or the lack of equipment needed for full recovery. Rail workers moved slowly along lines littered with steel fragments, trying to assess whether anything could be restored quickly enough to matter. Many sections were unsalvageable. Bomb craters filled with muddy water cut straight through routes essential for transporting reinforcements. Telegraph wires above the tracks hung in tangled messes. Stations that once operated as hubs for movement now lacked roofs, windows, or signalling systems. Every detail suggested paralysis. Nothing connected smoothly enough to support the rapid deployment required before coastal defences collapsed. Beyond the rail system, armoured units positioned inland faced their own immobility. Fuel reserves, already limited by stretched supply chains, had dwindled to critical levels. Storage facilities bombed earlier in the summer left large gaps in stocks. Truck convoys that attempted to deliver fuel had been scattered or destroyed during Allied air raids. Tank crews waited beside their machines, ready for orders, yet unable to start engines for lack of fuel. Metal hulls reflected morning light without movement. Tracks rested on dry earth that never shifted under their weight. Officers walked along rows of silent vehicles, inspecting each machine with growing frustration. Hatches remained open for ventilation. Tools lay scattered across maintenance areas, left behind by crews who had tried to stretch remaining resources as far as possible. Nothing they did changed the core problem. Engines that depended on fuel remained useless under skies monitored by Allied aircraft. Even the idea of siphoning fuel from lighter vehicles collapsed under shortages so severe that no workable reserves remained in surrounding depots. Road networks offered little improvement. Bomb damage scattered across highways and rural routes created blockages that slowed every attempt at movement. Bridges critical for connecting northern and southern units had collapsed into rivers, leaving only jagged remnants protruding from the water. Detours required hours of extra travel, yet fuel limitations prevented long-distance rerouting. Vehicles that tried to cross improvised wooden structures risked collapse under their own weight. Dust rose with every attempted movement, marking locations for Allied pilots circling above. Messages sent between units further inland reflected awareness that reinforcements would not reach the coast in time. Officers attempted to form march columns, but those columns broke apart before leaving their assembly areas. Lack of transport forced many units to consider travelling on foot, yet distances stretched too far to be bridged quickly enough to influence the fighting. Soldiers stood beside roads littered with debris, watching thin columns of smoke rising toward the coastline while knowing they would never arrive before the situation intensified beyond control. Attempts to redirect reinforcements through remaining routes met repeated obstacles. Roads narrowed to single lanes where rubble covered half their width. Vehicles stalled on inclines where engines lacked the strength to pull through damaged terrain. Crews abandoned trucks when they could no longer be repaired or moved, leaving them scattered across fields and ditches. What should have been structured movement dissolved into isolated attempts to overcome destruction too widespread to navigate. Within rear command posts, officers reviewed reports with growing resignation. Charts detailing optimal routes sat covered in markings indicating closures, collapses, and impassable zones. Every alternative pathway circled back to the same limitations. Observers watched the situation unfold through distant flashes of light along the horizon, while understanding that no coordinated reinforcement would reach the front before the outcome of the morning solidified. Hours that should have delivered support slipped by without progress. Supply depots added further constraints. Stockpiles of ammunition, fuel, and spare parts sat in locations too far from the coast to influence immediate defence. Transport units lacked the vehicles needed to carry supplies forward. Bomb damage around depots forced workers to move materials by hand, slowing distribution even more. Every logistical movement encountered delays that compounded into complete stagnation. Soldiers waited for updates that never brought solutions. Across the countryside, tension grew heavier. The landscape, once considered stable territory, felt distant from the unfolding battle yet deeply connected to its fate. Reinforcements trapped by broken infrastructure carried an awareness that their inactivity contributed to the collapse forming at the beaches. They listened to the low rumble rolling through the air with each explosion along the coast, knowing each passing minute widened the gap between what was needed and what could actually be done. When midday arrived, the truth settled unmistakably across the rear lines. Nothing would reach the frontline positions in time. The defensive network that had been built to function through speed and coordination had lost both. Pathways that should have carried strength toward the coast now existed only as scattered segments of road, rail, and bridgework lying in ruin. The coastline was left to absorb the invasion without the reinforcements that should have supported it. Rear positions remained frozen behind collapsed infrastructure, leaving coastal defences without the support they depended on. Hours drifted by while silence filled the space where movement should have been. Tremors from the shoreline were already spreading inward, preparing to mark new stages of the battle. As the invasion spread inland, scattered German positions searched for units capable of mounting disciplined resistance. Among those still retaining some degree of readiness were the Fallschirmjäger. Their reputation had been formed through earlier campaigns, built on precision, endurance, and controlled aggression. Yet on this morning, they confronted conditions that strained every aspect of their training. Reports from coastal defences reached them in fractured pieces. Each message described collapse, disconnection, or silence from positions that once anchored the front line. Attempts to regroup these units began near Carentan, where terrain offered corridors that could redirect movement toward key junctions. Fields lay heavy with moisture from earlier rainfall. Roads cut through stretches of hedgerows that concealed movement, but also restricted visibility. Fallschirmjäger companies advanced along these narrow routes with caution, aware that every step brought them closer to an enemy presence expanding rapidly from the beaches. Their pace reflected discipline, yet discipline alone could not overcome the limitations pressing onto them from all sides. Numbers presented an immediate challenge. Units positioned near Carentan lacked full strength. Some companies had been depleted by previous deployments. Others had received only partial resupply in the days before the invasion. Reinforcements from distant sectors never arrived due to the same logistical collapse affecting other branches of the German military. Soldiers moved through the countryside with fewer men than their formations required for sustained combat. Gaps within their ranks stretched too far to conceal. Ammunition shortages intensified the problem. Supply lines already weakened by air raids failed to deliver consistent stock. Crates intended for the Fallschirmjäger lay scattered across damaged depots, unreachable due to blocked roads or destroyed bridges. Soldiers carried what they could, relying on careful rationing that slowed their ability to counterattack with full strength. Machine gun crews prepared for limited burst rather than prolonged fire. Riflemen checked their pouches repeatedly, fully aware of how quickly ammunition would run out under pressure. Coordination with armour, essential for any successful counterattack, existed more in intention than reality. Tank crews positioned inland struggled to move due to fuel shortages. Vehicles that might have supported the Fallschirmjäger sat idle behind tree lines or inside barns converted into improvised shelters. Engines remained silent under empty fuel tanks. Even when some tanks attempted movement, the obstructed roads forced them into narrow paths that offered little flexibility. The Fallschirmjäger's understanding of the broader tactical picture shifted from expectation to resignation as delays compounded. Despite these constraints, the units pressed toward Carentan with steady determination. They moved through hedgerows dense enough to block sound, emerging only briefly into open fields before disappearing into the next corridor of greenery. Each sector of terrain concealed unknown dangers. Smoke drifted from distant villages struck by early bombardment. Farmhouses once filled with livestock stood empty. Broken equipment lay near road intersections, suggesting earlier attempts by German units to reposition before being scattered. Observations of Allied numbers became clearer as the Fallschirmjäger approached the contested areas. Movement along distant ridges indicated troop concentrations larger than anything they could assemble in response. Columns advanced with structure, supported by equipment that seemed endless in supply. When first contact occurred, the disparity in strength became unmistakable. Rifle shots from German positions found targets, yet the return fire arrived with intensity that exceeded expectations. The sound spread through hedgerows, filling narrow spaces with vibrations that carried through soil, timber, and undergrowth. Fallschirmjäger squads operated with precision, shifting positions to avoid encirclement. They held defensive lines as long as possible, relying on terrain to delay the incoming pressure. Small pockets of resistance formed around crossroads or riverbanks, where groups of soldiers attempted to slow progress with concentrated bursts. Yet each stand diminished their strength further. Ammunition dwindled with every exchange. Communications failed as wires snapped or radios jammed under interference. Orders that were meant to coordinate their movements dissolved into improvisation. In multiple sectors, the weight of Allied presence proved overwhelming. Units advancing toward Carentan carried momentum supported by equipment, organization, and depth of manpower. Each time the Fallschirmjäger attempted to consolidate, fresh waves of enemy troops pressed forward. Mortar rounds fell across hedgerow lines with a steady rhythm. Rifle fire grew thicker. Movement along flanking routes threatened to encircle isolated German positions. The Fallschirmjäger withdrew from some sectors, not due to lack of will, but due to the impossibility of holding ground with shrinking resources. Terrain complexity added new challenges. Hedgerows created natural barriers that restricted lines of fire, forcing German soldiers into tight formations vulnerable to concentrated attacks. Attempts to shift positions through enclosed fields turned into slow, exhausting movements that exposed them to incoming rounds. Even retreat required coordination they no longer possessed. Soldiers navigated ditches filled with mud, climbed over fallen branches, or crawled along embankments while incoming fire struck the edges of the foliage around them. Carentan's outskirts were marked by tension rising from both sides. Buildings shook from mortar impacts. Narrow streets collected debris blown from rooftops. German defenders attempted to reorganize within these confined spaces, but each movement met with pressure that grew heavier by the minute. Every position required more manpower than they had available. Every strong point demanded ammunition that they could not supply. The Fallschirmjäger, known for resilience, confronted the limits of endurance when numbers diminished to levels far below operational strength. By midday, the truth became clear within their ranks. They could slow progress, but could not stop it. Every engagement cost them more than it cost the enemy. Officers observing the situation recognized that their resistance, though disciplined, existed within conditions that offered no realistic prospect of holding ground. Carentan, once envisioned as a pivot point for counterattack, instead marked the meeting place where German shortages collided with Allied superiority. Throughout the countryside, remnants of Fallschirmjäger units withdrew through hedgerows, carrying memories of engagements that revealed the scale of the challenge before them. Their retreat reflected not failure of skill but failure of logistics, coordination, and support. Each surviving soldier understood that the battle was shifting irreversibly toward the invaders, leaving them to navigate terrain that now favored the side pressing inland with unbroken momentum. Fallschirmjäger resistance stretched across terrain that consumed strength faster than it could be replaced. Carentan revealed gaps no training could cover as numbers tilted sharply against them. Movements pushing deeper inland were already preparing to absorb what remained of these scattered defenders. Morning light spread across the coastline while German troops on the ground waited for support they believed would rise into the sky at any moment. Throughout earlier campaigns, air units had provided cover, reconnaissance, or at least disruption against enemy movements. Yet on this day, the sky remained still. No engines roared overhead, no shadows swept across the ground. Nothing broke the emptiness stretching above the battlefield. Soldiers felt the weight of that silence long before they understood its full meaning. The Luftwaffe had already been strained by months of attrition. Airfields scattered across the occupied territory held fewer operational aircraft than required for full engagement. Bombing raids earlier in the summer left hangars damaged, runways cracked, and fuel stocks dangerously low. Mechanics worked through nights attempting to repair what remained, yet shortages in spare parts limited progress. Engines that might have been serviceable sat in workshops without the components needed for basic function. Pilots waited beside grounded aircraft, listening to distant explosions with the knowledge that flight would not come in time. Across airfields near northern France, personnel moved through long rows of aircraft that could not leave the ground. Some sat with open panels exposing engines partially dismantled for maintenance that could not be completed. Others rested at odd angles due to weakened landing gear. Fuel trucks remained parked near storage depots that had been struck repeatedly, leaving reserves too small to sustain meaningful sorties. Ground crews walked between these silent machines, aware that the sky over Normandy would remain empty of German presence. From the perspective of soldiers positioned along the coast, the absence became sharper with each passing minute. They watched columns of smoke rising from distant ships without interruption from friendly aircraft. Bombardment thundered across the shoreline without counterattack from above. The horizon was filled with Allied planes that moved freely in wide arcs, diving, circling, and climbing without challenge. Their numbers shifted constantly, forming patterns that reflected complete control of the air. German soldiers lifted their eyes toward those movements with quiet resignation, understanding that they stood exposed. Allied aircraft swept inland with precision. Bombers released their payloads onto defensive positions. Fighters strafed roads, bridges, and vehicles attempting to reposition. Reconnaissance planes traced routes through the sky, sending updates that refined the overall coordination of the invasion. These aircraft operated in layers, one supporting the next, creating an interconnected presence that shaped every element of the ground battle. German defenders struggled to move without attracting attention from above. Dust clouds, vehicle tracks, or metallic reflections risked immediate attack. Within command posts, officers reviewed reports that confirmed what the men on the ground already sensed. Luftwaffe units committed to Normandy could not take off in significant numbers. Pilots prepared for emergency missions, yet their aircraft remained grounded under circumstances impossible to overcome. Each hour reinforced that no intervention from the air would disrupt the invasion. Message after message signaled urgent need, yet nothing could rise to answer those calls. Radios crackled with transmission requests that carried no reply. The imbalance in the sky created an atmosphere of vulnerability. German troops advancing toward positions near Carentan or attempting to reach the coastline found themselves halted repeatedly by strafing runs. Columns travelling along narrow roads scattered when aircraft emerged over ridges without warning. Vehicles abandoned in ditches marked the path of destruction left behind. Smoke from burning convoys curled upward, creating signals that drew further attacks. The countryside became a landscape shaped by the constant presence of engines humming overhead. Defensive movements suffered deeply under this pressure. Artillery units attempting to reposition fell under direct observation. Each shift produced dust or noise that revealed their location. Enemy pilots guided bombardment toward these positions with precision. Infantry moving through hedgerows occasionally found temporary concealment, yet open stretches exposed them instantly. The absence of cloud cover left them fully visible to aircraft scanning the terrain. Every attempt to reorganize was met with interruption from above. German anti-aircraft batteries attempted to create zones of resistance, but their capacity was limited. Many guns lacked ammunition for sustained fire. Others had been positioned to defend industrial sites rather than rural roads or coastal corridors. When they managed to fire, the sheer number of enemy aircraft diminished their impact. Tracers climbed toward the sky only to vanish into empty air, missing targets that maneuvered quickly. The effort did little to slow the overall Allied presence. On the ground, communication grew more strained as aircraft targeted radio vehicles and command trucks. Units that had already struggled with damaged lines now lost the remaining channels that might have allowed coordinated movement. Officers attempting to assess the situation often relied on visual observation alone, yet visibility offered no optimism. Each hour carved deeper gaps between what the German defence needed and what reality could provide. The psychological weight of the empty sky pressed heavily onto all who fought on the German side. Throughout earlier campaigns, they had grown accustomed to hearing the engines of Luftwaffe aircraft during critical moments. On this day, that familiar support never arrived. Instead, every sound came from enemy planes controlling the air with precision. German soldiers felt their isolation grow as bombardment cut through defensive positions with no interruption. The distance between ground units and any hope of reinforcement widened until it felt absolute. By midday, the truth had settled completely. The air war over Normandy belonged entirely to the invaders. Without support from above, German defences along the coast remained pinned, unable to reposition or counterattack with freedom. The imbalance shaped the entire battle, allowing Allied troops to expand inland while German units absorbed the full weight of bombardment without relief. The absence of the Luftwaffe removed a critical layer of resistance that might have slowed or disrupted the advance. Silence in the sky left German defenders exposed to constant pressure from above, reducing every step on the ground to risk. Vulnerability spread across the landscape as control tilted fully toward the invaders. What emerged from the beaches was already gathering strength, preparing to push inland with momentum untouched by resistance from overhead. Pressure along the Normandy front deepened as the morning advanced. The landscape shifted under relentless bombardment, filling trenches, bunkers, and open fields with smoke that limited vision and narrowed awareness. German soldiers positioned across these fractured lines sensed that every attempt to organize resistance became harder as time passed. Sounds moved through the terrain from multiple directions, leaving no clear sense of where danger concentrated most heavily. Each corner of the battlefield carried weight that pressed into their movements. From the beaches, waves of invading troops extended further inland. German defenders trying to reposition found their routes blocked by craters, rubble, or collapsed structures, sand-coated equipment, clothing, and skin until everything felt heavier. Soldiers stepping through narrow trenches paused frequently, listening for indications of movement behind or beside them. Open spaces no longer offered mobility. Instead, they became traps where exposure meant immediate threat from enemy fire or incoming shells. Pressure from the sky intensified this suffocating environment. Aircraft circled above with steady repetition, their presence turning every noise on the ground into potential danger. Strafing runs targeted columns attempting to move away from compromised positions. Bombers struck intersections where soldiers tried to regroup. Smoke rising from these impacts settled across roads, blurring outlines of vehicles and equipment left behind. German troops advancing towards safer ground often found themselves forced to retreat into trenches for cover. To the rear, positions weakened by earlier attacks no longer offered reliable support. Communication lines are fragmented under constant strain. Messages that attempted to provide direction arrived incomplete or distorted. Orders to fall back lacked clarity, written in vague terms that left officers uncertain about which routes remained viable. Soldiers waited for signals that might lead them toward reorganized defensive points, yet those signals rarely arrived. The silence that followed certain requests revealed that some units no longer existed in any functional state. In many sectors, the pressure came not only from the front or the sky, but also from flanking movements. Hedgerows concealed advancing enemy units that emerged suddenly from narrow corridors. German soldiers found themselves surrounded by movement that pushed from unexpected angles. Attempts to reposition often resulted in contact with enemy patrols already occupying what had been assumed to be safe ground. These sudden encounters severed confidence, creating moments of confusion that spread quickly across lines already under severe strain. The absence of clear retreat routes intensified this sense of entrapment. Bridges previously destroyed by air raids left the rivers uncrossable. Roads leading inland had become congested with abandoned vehicles, debris, or bomb craters. Officers attempting to lead small groups out of vulnerable positions encountered dead ends that forced them back toward terrain already compromised. Every potential exit presented a new risk, leaving soldiers circling through pockets of land where bombardment had carved unpredictable pathways. Within trenches, the air thickened with dust stirred by each incoming shell. Walls built from timber or soil slumped inward. Debris slid into walkways, narrowing the space available for movement. Soldiers crouched along these confined corridors, feeling vibrations through their boots as explosions continued in the distance. Those who tried to shift along communication trenches often found sections collapsed or filled with water. Each obstacle slowed progress, trapping them further inside positions no longer capable of providing long-term protection. Attacks from the coastline continued to push deeper, creating pressure that spread behind initial lines. German soldiers in these areas felt contact from multiple directions simultaneously. Some positions faced fire from the front while flanking units pressed in from the side. Others endured bombardment from above while hearing distant exchanges behind them, revealing that enemy units had already passed through sectors believed to be secure. This multi-directional compression stripped the defenders of any sense of orientation. Fear of encirclement grew heavier with each hour. Soldiers recognized that resistance offered diminishing returns. Ammunition levels dropped steadily. Medical supplies ran low. Water became scarce in positions where containers had been destroyed. Wounded men waited in shallow depressions or behind shattered structures without hope of evacuation. Every basic resource diminished under the strain of continuous pressure. As the morning progressed, surrender emerged as an unavoidable decision for some units. Small groups lifted their hands or stepped out from bunkers when they realized that further resistance meant certain destruction without any strategic purpose. Others hesitated until enemy troops appeared from behind, forcing them to confront the truth that they no longer held ground in any direction. Fear mixed with exhaustion, creating moments where instinct for survival outweighed loyalty to orders that no longer connected to any functional command structure. The psychological weight of this compression deepened. German soldiers felt their world shrinking with each new movement across the battlefield. Trenches that once offered security turned into narrow corridors filled with fallen debris. Open fields provided no escape. Roads led into sectors already occupied. Even the sky pressed downward through repeated air attacks that limited any sense of control. What had begun as an organized defensive effort dissolved into scattered pockets of men surrounded by a battlefield, shifting too quickly for any one group to contain. By midday, the German front lines resembled isolated fragments rather than unified defences. Groups of soldiers waited in shallow positions, listening to movement approaching from several directions at once. Those still holding rifles understood that their ability to influence the outcome had nearly vanished. Everything pressed inward noise, dust, fire, and uncertainty. The sense of being creased from every direction became not just perception, but physical reality, shaping each remaining decision. Pressure across the collapsing lines built into a steady realization that resistance could not hold much longer. Momentum carried forward through weakened defences as territory fell away under relentless strain. New complications waited ahead, tightening the landscape around German troops even further. German soldiers moved through the unfolding events with a growing sense that their situation was being shaped by decisions far beyond their control. And this feeling deepened as communication from higher command continued to falter during the crucial morning hours of the landings. They had stationed themselves along defensive lines, believing support would arrive whenever pressure intensified. Yet the hours stretched without clarity, leaving entire companies listening to distant explosions without any assurance that reinforcements were even on their way. They waited behind machine gun nests, in trenches carved into the soil, and inside concrete bunkers with the expectation that coordination from command would guide them. But instead they received silence, interrupted only by fragmented signals that had no direct relevance to their immediate surroundings. When the first waves of Allied forces surged up the beaches, these frontline soldiers found themselves reacting instinctively, firing where they could, repositioning as needed, and watching ammunition supply dwindle faster than anticipated because logistics had not been prepared to support a prolonged confrontation. As they struggled to understand why their messages for assistance gained no response, the sense of abandonment began to settle into their minds in a way that felt heavier than the bombardment outside their positions. Some battalions attempted limited counterattacks, believing support would arrive as soon as the situation worsened. But no clear orders came to confirm whether these maneuvers were part of a coordinated plan or simply isolated actions taken in the hope of stabilizing the line. Whole units reported their status on radio channels only to realize that the network had collapsed hours earlier, leaving them in practical isolation despite being technically part of a larger army spread across the region. Officers tried to maintain morale by giving short instructions meant to keep soldiers focused on the immediate threats. Yet even these directives lacked conviction once it became evident that the promised armoured support had not been authorised. In some areas, men could hear the distant rumble of tanks that never arrived at their sector, creating a strange mixture of hope and despair that grew sharper with each minute of waiting. Along positions near the primary approach, corridors leading inland, German infantry could see the Allies advancing in formations that indicated clear coordination, and this contrast to their own absence of direction intensified their frustration. They watched as smoke drifted across the fields, marking destroyed emplacements that had received no assistance despite repeated requests sent earlier in the morning. Worse still, neighbouring units occasionally withdrew without warning, not because they had been ordered to manoeuvre, but because their own officers could no longer justify remaining in positions that were rapidly being overrun with no sign of relief. These sudden gaps in the defensive line deepened the sense that command had lost control, leaving the frontline troops exposed on flanks they had assumed were secure. Reports circulated quietly among soldiers that certain senior officers had abandoned their posts even before the intensity of the landings reached its peak. Stories of command vehicles disappearing down roads earlier in the day, long before any official withdrawal order had been issued, passed from trench to trench in subdued tones. No one could verify them fully, yet the pattern of disorganized retreats seemed to support the idea that leadership had fractured under pressure. Soldiers who had fought in earlier campaigns compared the stability of previous command structures with the uncertainty they now faced, realizing that the rigid hierarchy they had once relied upon no longer functioned in the same manner. The men tried to hold their positions out of duty and instinct, but even this sense of resolve became difficult to maintain when every attempt to coordinate with higher headquarters resulted in confusion or unanswered calls. As Allied pressure increased on multiple fronts, the fragmentation inside German defences grew more visible. Some platoons stood firm in their positions waiting for directions that never came, believing that abandoning the line would worsen the situation further, while others chose to retreat based on local judgment rather than central orders. The battlefield became a series of disconnected pockets of resistance, each acting with little awareness of what was happening beyond their immediate surroundings. This lack of cohesion created mounting strain inside the minds of German soldiers, who understood that without synchronized action their defensive capabilities would collapse, yet were powerless to change the situation themselves. Equipment shortages added another layer of frustration, especially as the day progressed and ammunition supplies dwindled to critical levels. Soldiers had been told that reserves existed inland and would be directed to the front line when needed, yet these promises never materialized. They attempted to ration every round, counting them methodically while listening to the continuous fire from Allied positions that seemed never to fade. At the same time, the absence of air support reminded them that the Luftwaffe was no longer capable of intervening, leaving them exposed to aircraft strafing runs and bombardments without even the illusion of being covered by their own skies. Each moment spent crouched in trenches reinforced the sense that they were fighting alone in a battle that had once been described as fortified and secure. By midday, the emotional weight of perceived betrayal settled heavily across the defensive lines. Soldiers who had expected leadership to manage the chaos were instead left to interpret the battlefield on their own, making difficult decisions in isolation. They understood that their positions were collapsing not simply because of Allied strength, but because the command structure designed to support them had fractured when they needed it most. Looking across the smoke-filled terrain, many felt a quiet resignation forming, an acceptance that the unfolding events had slipped beyond their control long before they realized it. Their sense of abandonment hardened into a quiet understanding that support would not arrive. Confidence drained away as pressure on every position deepened across the weakened lines. Something darker waited just ahead, built from memories no soldier ever wished to carry. Memories carried by German soldiers from the beaches did not fade with distance or time. The first hours of the invasion carved impressions so severe that even hardened veterans struggled to explain them later in their lives. Many had entered the campaign believing they would hold the coastline with discipline and resolve. Yet what they witnessed along the waterline reshaped every assumption about war they had carried until then. The scenes that unfolded in front of them were not moments they could prepare for, because the scale of destruction reached far beyond the training grounds where they had learned to march, fire, and endure. Under the grey morning light, the entire shoreline felt like it had become a long field of loss, where no one could fully grasp what had just happened. Bodies drifting on the tide marked the first shock for many soldiers pulled from their positions to scan the coast. They watched uniforms rise and fall with the movement of seawater, each wave rolling over shapes they recognized as men who had stood beside them only hours earlier. The sight registered slowly as their minds tried to make sense of so many fallen within such a short span. Helmets floated near the surface, some overturned, others filled with sand and seawater, while rifles rested beneath the waves as if abandoned by hands that had suddenly lost their strength. The beach, dotted with debris and torn equipment, became a grim reminder that the invasion had struck exactly where they felt most exposed. The smell arrived before the mind could prepare for it, sinking into the air in a way that clung to every breath. Smoke drifting from shattered bunkers carried traces of burned metal, scorched fabric, and something far heavier. It rose from craters carved by naval artillery, from the remains of destroyed vehicles, and from equipment that had been smashed into pieces by explosives. That burnt scent hung over everything, lingering in the sand, in the wind, and even in the clothes of the soldiers who tried to regroup after the bombardment. Many later wrote that this smell stayed with them for years, because it belonged not only to destruction, but to the sudden end of comrades they had spoken to the previous day. Artillery had torn through defensive lines with such force that entire positions became unrecognizable. Some bunkers lay cracked open, exposing the inside as if a giant hand had ripped them apart. Trenches filled with debris made movement almost impossible. Soldiers who survived the barrage climbed over fallen beams, shattered concrete, and broken ammunition boxes, each step reminding them of how close they had come to being buried underneath. The injuries they witnessed added another layer of horror, because the bombardment did not leave clean wounds. It created scenes that soldiers struggled to describe even in private journals written decades later, with words chosen carefully to avoid recalling the full picture. Silence after the shelling was often worse than the explosions. For a few moments, no one could hear anything beyond the ringing in their ears, and the stillness made the devastation feel even heavier. Men moved slowly, stepping through sand that had been churned into clumps by falling shells. They looked for movement among the fallen, checking for signs of life, though most already knew what they would find. The longer they remained on the beach, the more the weight of the destruction pressed into them, as if the land itself was reminding them of how the day had begun. Even those not directly struck by the fighting carried emotional scars that left them awake at night long after the invasion ended. They recalled seeing fellow soldiers disappear behind smoke, only to find pieces of uniforms or equipment scattered in the aftermath. Memories of the constant noise from artillery, machine guns, and aircraft replayed in their minds during quiet moments, making it difficult to rest. Some developed a habit of sleeping lightly, listening for distant rumbling that no longer existed but felt as though it could return at any moment. Time away from the front did not erase these fears, because they sank too deeply into the rhythm of their thoughts. For many, the image of bodies washing ashore stayed as the clearest symbol of the day. The tide carried them in and out, each return revealing more details they wished they had never noticed. Faces pale from the cold sea water, limbs bent at unnatural angles, clothing torn by blasts or caught on obstacles placed along the beach. Soldiers tried to focus on repairs, reorganizing their units, or preparing to fall back, yet their eyes continued drifting to the shoreline, where the waves kept repeating the same painful truth. Some collected dog tags when possible, a quiet gesture meant to preserve identity where chaos had taken everything else. Years later, veterans described the invasion not only as a military event, but as a moment when their understanding of life changed permanently. The violence of the morning did not stay behind in France. It followed them into civilian life, into family homes, into moments of solitude, and even into dreams that struck without warning. Many learned to speak little about the experience, not out of shame, but because words rarely captured the emotional weight carried from those first hours on the beach. They lived the remainder of their lives with memories they never fully escaped. Reminders of a dawn that reshaped every thought they had about war. Those memories settled deep within the soldiers who survived the coastal assault, shaping a sense of dread that lingered long after the fighting moved inland. Pressure across the weakened ranks grew heavier as fear spread faster than orders. New terrors waited behind the lines, built not by the enemy alone but by forces that governed their own fate. Fear within German lines during the invasion did not come only from the advancing Allied forces. A second, quieter danger pressed down on soldiers from behind, shaping their actions as much as the shells falling from offshore. Supervision by Gestapo units and SS detachments created a constant sense of being watched, not as comrades but as potential subjects of suspicion. This pressure influenced every decision made by soldiers who already faced overwhelming firepower at the coastline. While they tried to hold their positions under bombardment, many remained equally aware that retreat without permission could result in punishment executed by their own leadership structures. Gestapo officers positioned behind the front monitored troop behaviour with strict expectations. Their presence gave soldiers little room for hesitation, because hesitation itself could be interpreted as unwillingness to fight. Quiet movements during the battle, glances toward possible escape routes, or attempts to regroup away from designated positions sometimes drew unwanted attention. Soldiers understood that these observers served a political mandate rather than a strategic one, enforcing loyalty through fear rather than coordination. This awareness weighed on infantry units already struggling to survive the relentless assault from sea and air. SS detachments stationed in reserve zones acted with similar authority. They patrolled roads, monitored crossroads, and established checkpoints to evaluate whether retreating soldiers carried legitimate orders. If papers failed to satisfy the officers in charge, the consequences were often immediate. Accounts written after the war described firing squads assembled within minutes, creating scenes as grim as those produced by the battle itself. The discipline imposed through violent enforcement became a separate threat that amplified the psychological burden on ordinary troops. Many understood that survival on the battlefield did not guarantee safety in the rear. Reports spread quickly across units, reinforcing the sense of danger. Stories of soldiers shot for suspected desertion without formal investigation travelled from bunker to bunker as men awaited new commands. Some heard of executions carried out behind dunes or near damaged roads, where scattered equipment still marked the chaos of the early morning landings. The knowledge that such punishment could occur without warning altered behaviour at every level. Soldiers became cautious not only of shells bursting overhead, but of movements that could draw suspicion from their own superiors. The balance between fighting an overwhelming enemy and avoiding internal scrutiny created a mental strain few could manage easily. Soldiers shaken by bombardment forced themselves to stay in exposed positions longer than reason allowed, afraid that pulling back even a short distance would be seen as retreat. Injured men sometimes hesitated to fall behind the lines for treatment because they feared accusations of faking wounds. Younger soldiers, less experienced with the realities of war, struggled the most, as they lacked both the confidence and the clarity needed to navigate the unspoken rules imposed by security units. Throughout the day, this internal threat shaped the rhythm of German defense efforts. Units that might have repositioned to better ground remained stuck in compromised bunkers, unwilling to risk accusations. Commanders who recognized the need for tactical withdrawal sometimes delayed their orders out of fear that higher authorities would view these decisions as weakness. As a result, many positions collapsed more quickly than they might have if movement had been allowed without political oversight. Soldiers caught in collapsing defences often found themselves trapped between enemy fire and internal enforcement, with no safe direction to move. The psychological toll deepened as the invasion expanded. Exhausted men struggled to process both the chaos in front of them and the pressure behind them. They knew that Allied forces advanced with superior numbers, yet they also knew that falling back without explicit permission could lead to immediate execution. This internal conflict created a tension that eroded morale rapidly. Units that had entered the campaign ready to defend the coastline now faced a reality where loyalty to the regime came into direct conflict with personal instinct for survival. As the hours stretched, fear of their own security detachment sometimes overshadowed fear of the Allied onslaught. Soldiers who might have surrendered under different circumstances remained in crumbling positions, because surrender carried not only danger from enemy fire, but potential retaliation from their own side if they were caught attempting it. Attempts to coordinate retreat became nearly impossible, since men feared that even discussing such actions could be overheard. Distrust seeped into interactions between soldiers who had once relied on each other completely. This environment left many with lasting emotional damage. After the war, survivors described how the pressure from behind created a unique form of dread, different from the fear produced by combat. They recalled glancing over their shoulders even years later, out of habit formed during the invasion. They spoke of the heavy silence that followed executions carried out by their own forces, a silence that suggested not discipline but despair. For many, this fear remained one of the most haunting aspects of the campaign, because it revealed how deeply the regime distrusted the very men it expected to defend its territory. By the time the front line began to collapse, soldiers trapped between the enemy and their own security forces realized they had no real avenue towards safety. Some tried to move into new positions under the cover of smoke, hoping to avoid both dangers. Others stayed in place until ammunition ran out, unable to decide whether to risk retreat or wait for capture. The emotional weight of facing two threats at once left scars that did not fade even as years passed. What remained after the guns fell silent was a memory of fighting not only for survival against an invading force, but also against the harsh control of the regime they served. Pressure from both front and rear sank deeply into every soldier who endured that day, leaving them unsure of where safety truly existed. Quiet uncertainty continued to spread as the invasion pushed inland. New revelations waited in the shadows of collapsing units, carried in private writings that surfaced long after the war. Fear had grown into something so heavy that even the idea of injury began to feel like relief. Along the front, soldiers who had once tried to hold their ground now felt uncertainty spreading through every thought, pushing them toward choices they would never have imagined during earlier stages of the war. Bunkers that once offered protection had become traps, sealed by collapsing earth, or scorched by flames pushed inward from explosions. The pressure built quietly inside these confined spaces until no one could ignore it any longer. They watched bodies carried away without ceremony, some burned beyond recognition, others mangled by shrapnel, all reminding them of what could happen within the next attack. In that atmosphere, the hope of escaping through a minor wound crept into their minds with disturbing clarity. For soldiers trapped inside dugouts shaken by artillery, the heat that surged through each bombardment turned the air thick enough to choke. Flames swept across openings faster than anyone could crawl. Smoke pressed against their lungs, forcing them to breathe in short, painful bursts. The smallest spark could ignite ammunition stored along the walls, sending shards of metal in every direction. Nothing about the environment felt stable. Each man knew that if fire reached his position during a bombing run, survival would depend entirely on luck. A burn across the arm or leg seemed insignificant compared to the possibility of being engulfed. They saw comrades emerge from these fires, screaming without sound, their voices already lost to smoke damage, bodies collapsing before help arrived. The memory settled into every thought, making the idea of a manageable injury feel like the only escape still within reach. Fear also came from above. Aircraft crossed the sky repeatedly, dropping bombs with precision that the defenders had not expected. Trenches shook so violently that men were thrown against walls, crushing fingers or breaking ribs without warning. Some crawled forward after explosions with torn uniforms and dirt embedded deeply in their skin, but felt grateful simply to be breathing. They understood that a minor wound could place them on a stretcher headed away from the chaos. Hospital tents, although crowded, represented quiet moments far from the coastline. The smell of disinfectant and the presence of nurses felt like another world entirely. That contrast fed the disturbing wish within many soldiers who had once prided themselves on toughness. Survival had become more desirable than loyalty. Injury had transformed into a narrow bridge that might lead away from death. Rumours spread quickly among the ranks. Men whispered that those lightly wounded were being transported inland, leaving the front lines for medical exams or rest camps. The idea drifted from one unit to another until young soldiers believed it completely. They pictured soft beds, warmer meals, and calmer nights. Nothing in that fantasy matched the reality of military hospitals, but imagination was stronger than truth in moments of fear. They watched stretcher bearers appear after each bombardment, carrying someone whose clothing was torn, whose skin was pale, whose breathing was shallow yet steady. Those images provided a strange comfort. Many envied the injured man, even while knowing he had suffered pain. That painful path still appeared more merciful than remaining in the collapsing defences. Some soldiers reached the point where they viewed self-inflicted wounds as a possible answer. The thought came slowly at first, building through exhaustion, days without proper rest, nights filled with constant bombardment, hunger, thirst, and the absence of clear leadership all joined together. A man could sit in darkness and feel pressure from every side. Any sound from outside could trigger panic powerful enough to shake his hands. In those moments, the idea of firing a bullet into a limb seemed like the final option left to maintain life. It was not a choice fueled by cowardice, but by a desire to survive a situation that felt impossible. A torn muscle or fractured bone seemed minor compared to what had happened to those caught inside burning bunkers. Fear pushed reason aside, yet danger existed within the rear positions as well. Soldiers who intentionally injured themselves risked being discovered by military police or SS personnel. Punishment would be immediate. Death was likely. That fear created conflict inside every man who considered such an action. They weighed the chance of survival against the possibility of execution. Some convinced themselves that a stray piece of shrapnel could easily be blamed for a wound. Others feared that even a minor injury, if suspicious, would lead to questioning that no one could escape. Sleepless nights deepened their torment. They lay awake listening to distant bombing runs, each explosion tightening the knot inside their chest. During the brief quiet moments at dawn, some touched their arms or legs, imagining how it would feel to be struck by a fragment rather than by the violent flames that consumed entire bunkers. The coastline had turned into a place where every man felt trapped between two forms of death. Pressure from the invasion pushed forward. Pressure from military discipline pushed backward. Very little room remained for rational decisions. The weight of this tension carved itself into their faces, creating expressions that would stay with them for decades. Men who survived later described those hours as moments when the mind split into two halves. One half tried to hold the line. The other half searched desperately for any way out. With every bombardment, the second half grew stronger. As casualties rose, the number of soldiers secretly wishing for a wound increased. They no longer imagined victory. They no longer believed reinforcements would arrive in time. Escape became the only thought strong enough to overpower fear. It was a silent hope carried through the trenches, never spoken aloud but widely shared. No one could admit it during the battle, yet many felt it deeply. A single injury had become the faint doorway toward survival. Exhaustion carved these thoughts into the minds of men who once marched with confidence. Retreat from the front felt impossible, while pressure continued to rise behind them. Darkness ahead concealed realizations waiting inside shaken units where morale was close to breaking. Pressure from the coastline had begun to seep into every layer of the German military structure, turning confidence into something fragile. Soldiers who once marched with firm belief now carried doubt in every movement, feeling the weight of losses that stretched across the beaches, villages, fields, and forests of northern France. Reports from the front grew increasingly grim, describing shattered units, broken defences, and positions abandoned after heavy bombardment. Nothing felt stable anymore. Men sat inside half-destroyed bunkers listening to distant explosions that signalled another failed attempt to hold the line. Bodies arrived from the beaches wrapped in torn blankets or rough canvas, each one a reminder that the tide of the war had started to shift irreversibly. Rumours surfaced quickly, carried from one trench to another by messengers, medics, or retreating units. Soldiers whispered about defeats in Italy, describing how positions once thought secure had collapsed under Allied pressure. Others spoke of Russian forces breaking through defences in the east, pushing deeper into territories that Germany had claimed earlier in the war. These stories spread without confirmation, yet felt believable because every man could sense the weakening of their own lines. Nothing seemed distant anymore. Crises that once felt separate now merged into a single heavy truth. A sense of deterioration moved through every camp like cold air settling before a storm. Behind the front, supply points looked more disorganized than ever. Ammunition arrived late or in smaller quantities. Food shipments stalled for days, forcing soldiers to stretch rations that were already insufficient. Vehicles broke down along the roads leading inland, their engines silent due to fuel shortages. Commanders tried to encourage their units by promising reinforcements, but everyone knew reinforcements no longer existed in meaningful numbers. Half-strength divisions were being called fresh despite lacking manpower, equipment, or direction. Men realized they were fighting a battle that could not be won, no matter how long they held their ground. In the camps, exhaustion clung to every corner. Soldiers tried to sleep on damp mattresses, but the constant movement of aircraft overhead kept them alert even during the quiet hours. Every rumble in the distance sounded like another wave of artillery. Night offered no rest. Faces grew pale. Voices softened. A dull acceptance spread through the ranks. Some men stared at the ground for long stretches, trapped inside thoughts they had never shared with anyone. Others wrote brief notes to their families without describing the true situation, unable to admit how hopeless the front had become. These small acts revealed how deeply morale had crumbled. Attempts to rebuild confidence came too late. High-ranking officers toured the camps, giving speeches that emphasized duty and sacrifice. The soldiers listened, but their expression stayed unchanged. They had witnessed too much during the early days of the invasion. They had seen men burn inside bunkers, choke in smoke-filled trenches, collapse under collapsing ceilings, or drown beneath rising tides. No speech could erase those memories. The weight of reality pressed harder than any command could counter. Soldiers looked at one another with eyes that reflected the same fear. knowing that they were all thinking the same thoughts. Survival was becoming more important than victory. Weathered soldiers who had fought since the early years of the war felt the shift most sharply. They had endured brutal winters, crushing offensives, hunger, sickness, and exhaustion. Yet the atmosphere after D-Day felt uniquely heavy. It carried a quiet finality. They recognized the signs of collapse. Lines stretched too thin, communication fractured under pressure, leadership fractured as well. Orders lacked clarity. Some directives contradicted previous instructions, leaving units confused about where to move or who to support. That confusion drained morale further, making each man feel increasingly isolated. Younger soldiers felt the collapse too, though in a different way. Many had entered the war believing Germany's early victories reflected superiority. Their training emphasized confidence while ignoring the realities of long-term conflict. When they saw the sudden force of the Allied invasion, that belief cracked instantly. They had not expected such numbers, such coordination, or such relentless pressure from the air. Each bombardment shattered another piece of youthful certainty. That loss settled into their expressions, turning eagerness into silence. Youth had no protection against the truth unfolding around them. As days passed, a subtle shift occurred inside the camps. Conversations became shorter, footsteps slower, laughter disappeared entirely. Even the sound of soldiers preparing equipment lacked the energy it once held. Everything felt muted, heavy, resigned. Men who had once marched with determination now moved as though carrying invisible weight. They understood that the war they had been promised no longer existed. Victory had faded into memory. Only survival remained. Morale finally reached a point where even the thought of reinforcement no longer sparked hope. Soldiers knew reinforcements, if they came at all, would be small groups of inexperienced men rushed through training. They knew those men would face overwhelming firepower without preparation. They knew their own chances were shrinking. Acceptance, as silent as falling dust, settled over the ranks. Despair spread through the units as losses mounted across every direction. Hesitation deepened when fresh reports revealed the scale of collapse behind the beaches. A harsh truth waited within the thoughts of officers who sensed that discipline alone could not repair a fractured army. Quiet moments behind the damaged lines offered soldiers a rare chance to sit still, giving them time to open small notebooks they kept hidden inside pockets or wrapped in cloth beneath their uniforms. These notebooks had followed them through long marches, nights inside muddy fields, cramped bunkers, and chaotic retreats. Pages had become wrinkled from moisture. Ink had smeared across certain lines. Yet the act of writing gave them a small sense of control in a place where everything else felt unpredictable. Each soldier used these pages to trap thoughts they could not share aloud. Thoughts too heavy for conversation, too dangerous for open discussion. The war that surrounded them poured into these words slowly, revealing emotions they had carried silently through every bombardment. Anger often appeared first. Soldiers wrote about frustration toward commanders who sent orders without understanding the ground conditions. They described moments when reinforcements were promised but never arrived, leaving isolated units to absorb overwhelming fire until positions collapsed entirely. They wrote about long nights without proper shelter, without medical care, without supplies that had been guaranteed earlier in the campaign. Some lines expressed rage toward the distant offices where decisions were made without regard for the suffering unfolding across the coastline. That anger clung to the pages like dust, settling into every sentence, every pause, every detail. Even the most disciplined soldiers could not suppress the bitterness forming inside them. Despair followed closely behind. Some men described waking with the weight of dread pressing against their chests before the sun even rose. They wrote about dreams filled with scenes from the beaches, scenes they could not forget, no matter how hard they tried. Others described the numbness that came after days of watching comrades fall during bombardments. A few wrote about losing track of time inside trenches, unsure whether they had slept for minutes or hours. That confusion deepened their sense of isolation. Each entry revealed a mind stretched thin, trying to hold stable thoughts while the world around them crumbled. Nothing felt secure enough to trust. Even moments of quiet carried tension, as though another attack waited just beyond hearing. Thoughts of family appeared frequently. Soldiers wrote the names of wives, children, or parents across the tops of pages as if saying the names could anchor them. Some described longing for the smell of familiar fields or the quiet of a small kitchen back home. They imagined watching children run across yards or sitting at tables during quiet mornings. Those memories offered brief comfort, yet they also sharpened the pain of separation. Each man feared he might never return to these scenes. They knew that the invasion had shifted the direction of the war. They felt that their chances of survival had narrowed. This knowledge made their memories heavier, sinking deeper into the pages with every written line. Doubt appeared more cautiously. Soldiers had grown accustomed to propaganda that promised victory through determination and sacrifice. But after witnessing the scale of the Allied invasion, those promises began to ring hollow. Some men wrote about confusion regarding earlier speeches that insisted defeat was impossible. Others wrote about the difference between official reports and the reality unfolding along the coastline. They questioned why their commanders still spoke confidently, while every sign on the ground pointed toward collapse. A few entries revealed suspicion toward the messages broadcast across loudspeakers or printed in newspapers. These soldiers did not yet write clearly about disbelief, but the seeds were there, forming in the spaces between sentences, in hesitations where confidence once existed. Fear hovered behind every entry. They wrote about the constant hum of aircraft overhead, the tremors of artillery, and the sound of waves slamming against the shore where bodies had drifted earlier. Some described crouching inside trenches during nighttime bombardments, while soil fell onto their helmets. Others wrote about the helplessness of watching fire spread through supply depots, turning crates of ammunition into bursts that tore through nearby positions. Even the quiet moments felt dangerous. Each soldier knew that a sudden attack could strike without warning. That awareness shaped every thought, every line of ink, every stroke of the pen. Despite all of this, the notebooks also revealed small attempts to preserve humanity. Soldiers wrote about sharing bread with comrades, about brief moments of quiet conversation, about the comfort of sitting near someone who understood the weight of fear. These entries reminded them of bonds formed under pressure. They offered a small light inside the darkness of war. Yet even those moments carried sadness, because each man knew the person beside him might not survive another day. The notebooks gradually filled with pages reflecting a collective collapse of confidence. No single entry could summarize the state of the army, but together they recorded a shift that could not be ignored. Words once written with firmness now appeared uncertain, trembling slightly across the paper. Letters curved differently after nights of little sleep. Sentences stretched longer as soldiers tried to process more than they could say aloud. These journals became silent witnesses to the erosion of belief in victory. These hidden pages preserved the thoughts of men who felt their world shrinking under relentless pressure. Each sentence recorded a small fracture in the confidence they once carried into battle. Deep inside those unfinished lines waited realizations that would haunt entire divisions during the retreat that followed. Retreat had begun long before the order was spoken aloud. Soldiers felt it approaching as pressure along the coastline intensified, creating an atmosphere so heavy that even the air seemed to resist movement. Every unit sensed the direction the war was taking, watching as positions once considered firm dissolved under bombardment. Paths that had served as supply routes now became escape corridors filled with scattered equipment, overturned carts, broken crates, and abandoned helmets. Infantry units moved through these narrow lanes with shoulders hunched low, hoping to avoid being spotted by aircraft that circled above in wide patterns. Each step felt uncertain, shaped by exhaustion that weighed on every muscle. The roads leading south quickly turned chaotic. Vehicles stalled on inclines due to fuel shortages, blocking the movement of those behind them. Soldiers shoved these useless machines toward ditches just to clear a narrow space for retreating columns. Tire tracks overlapped in thick mud, forming deep grooves that slowed movement further. Horses struggled to pull wagons overloaded with ammunition or medical supplies, often collapsing before reaching safer territory. When a wagon toppled, its contents spilled across the road, forcing entire groups to step around jagged debris. Nothing resembled an organised withdrawal. It was a slow unraveling of an army under tremendous stress. Men moved in long lines that lacked direction, searching for any route not already filled with others fleeing the same danger. Aircraft appeared frequently, flying low enough for soldiers to see sunlight glinting along their wings. Each time these engines roared overhead, men dropped flat onto the ground, covering their heads with trembling hands. Explosions followed, tearing holes into the road and sending dirt into the air like heavy curtains. Bodies were lifted from the ground by the force of the blasts. Craters formed so large that retreating columns needed to split apart and reform on the other side. That constant scattering broke units into smaller groups that lost contact with their commanders. Some men abandoned heavier weapons because carrying them slowed their pace. Others threw away ammunition pouches to run faster. Every decision reflected pure survival, not strategy. Retreating infantry often found themselves pushed into narrow forest paths. Tree branches whipped against their uniforms as they squeezed through, trying to avoid open areas vulnerable to aerial attacks. Forest floors were littered with discarded rifles, boots, and canteens. Some items had been dropped intentionally, others torn away during frantic escapes. The deeper they moved into the trees, the darker the air became. Sunlight filtered through in thin streaks, illuminating the tension on each soldier's face. They listened for any signal of pursuit, any rumble from tanks advancing behind them, any whistle of incoming shells. Silence felt dangerous. Noise felt worse. Nothing brought comfort. Further south, field hospitals struggled to handle the flow of injured men arriving from collapsing positions. Stretchers lined the ground outside overcrowded medical tents. Supplies were already low, leaving nurses to work with improvised materials. Some injured soldiers were placed on blankets spread over grass, waiting for care that could not come quickly enough. Panic grew when aircraft targeted these areas as well, forcing medical staff to shield patients with their bodies during attacks. Smoke rose from burning equipment, drifting across the horizon until the entire sky looked blurred. That haze became part of the retreat, following the soldiers like a constant reminder of the destruction overtaking every position they left behind. Rumours intensified as the retreat continued. Soldiers whispered that Allied forces had broken through secondary lines, pushing further inland than expected. Others spoke of units surrendering in groups because communication with command had collapsed entirely. No one could confirm anything, yet every rumour sounded possible. The fear of encirclement spread through the ranks. Men imagined being cut off in unfamiliar villages or trapped inside forest clearings with no support. This dread shaped their movements, forcing them to march faster even when their legs trembled from lack of sleep. Some had gone days without proper rest, marching through nights filled with distant artillery flashes. As the retreat extended deeper into France, soldiers began to realise that the collapse at Normandy had only been the beginning. They passed villages abandoned by civilians who had fled south long before the fighting reached them. Roads became lined with empty houses, shattered windows, and doors hanging crookedly from broken hinges. These scenes reinforced the sense that Germany's reach was shrinking rapidly. The army no longer looked like a force capable of recovery. It resembled a scattered collection of exhausted men trying to outrun a wave that kept rising behind them. Each day of retreat deepened that understanding. The farther they moved, the more the soldiers felt their identity as a unified force dissolve. Some units marched without officers. Others had officers but no clear orders. Maps grew outdated quickly as front lines shifted by the hour. A sense of hopelessness settled naturally. No speeches could counter it. No promises could reverse the reality unfolding around them. Even the weather seemed to echo their state of mind. Dust rose behind every group, coating uniforms that were already worn thin. Sweat mixed with dirt until faces lost any sign of youth or strength. Retreat had become a slow disintegration rather than a temporary repositioning. This movement south recorded the unraveling of an army that no longer controlled its own direction. Pressure from the invasion forced each unit to confront the truth hidden within earlier reports. Further revelations waited ahead, shaped by the moment soldiers finally accepted that defeat had taken root within their ranks. They had marched for years, believing momentum would carry them through any obstacle. Yet the coastline of France revealed something they had never confronted with such clarity. The invasion force that appeared beyond the fog carried a scale no German soldier had expected. Lines of ships stretched across the water until the horizon disappeared beneath steel hulls. The ground shook beneath precise bombardment that struck defences built through months of exhausting labour. The Atlantic Wall, once spoken of with pride, crumbled under pressure delivered with methodical force. Those watching from bunkers felt dread spreading into their thoughts long before the first Allied soldiers reached the sand. Positions that had seemed secure collapsed quickly. Overwhelmed infantry units attempted to reposition across trenches filled with smoke. Some tried to hold firing posts carved into concrete, but each blast from offshore guns shattered another layer of resistance. The coastline glowed with flames rising from ammunition stores that erupted after direct hits. Soldiers looked toward the sea, stunned by the relentless waves of landing craft pushing toward them. No training had prepared them for this sight. No speech from their officers could soften what they were witnessing. Every minute carried another reminder that Germany no longer controlled the pace of the war. Rumours reached them even during the fighting. Voices whispered that Italian fronts were collapsing. Others murmured that Russian units had broken through major defensive lines far to the east. These fragments created a picture darker than any official report. Soldiers pieced together the bits of information until they understood what commanders refused to say. This invasion was not an isolated event. It was the beginning of something larger. It was the moment when Germany faced pressure from every direction at once. Retreat no longer felt temporary. It felt permanent. During short pauses between bombardments, soldiers crouched behind ruined barriers with their helmets pressed against their knees. They felt the weight of exhaustion tug at their thoughts. Some stared into the dirt without blinking. Others breathed in heavy bursts as if trying to anchor themselves to the present. The air held the scent of burning fuel mixed with soil thrown upward by the explosions. Nothing around them resembled the confident army Europe had once feared. Equipment lay scattered across trenches. Communication lines had broken. Reinforcements failed to arrive. Even officers moved with hesitation, their gestures stripped of authority. Retreating units experienced this realization even more sharply. As they marched inland, they passed destroyed vehicles lining the roads, each blackened by flames or torn open by shrapnel. Bodies had been collected into groups along the edges, covered with whatever fabric soldiers could find. The scenes forced every man to confront what he had already begun to feel inside. The army was not repositioning, it was unraveling. Troops passing through bombed villages saw civilians fleeing their homes with belongings wrapped in cloth. These images reinforced the collapse. Civilian fear mirrored their own, reflecting the shared belief that Germany had lost control of the war's direction. Officers attempted to regain composure by organising small defensive pockets, yet each effort dissolved under the pressure of advancing Allied forces. Maps lost meaning as front lines shifted faster than messages could be delivered. Orders arrived late or contradicted previous instructions. Soldiers followed whatever direction kept them alive for another hour. Those small choices grew heavier as they noticed entire battalions disappearing from the fields behind them. Retreat had become a silent acknowledgement of defeat, though no one spoke the word aloud. Nightfall deepened the realization. The horizon flickered with distant explosions, lighting the sky in uneven pulses. Soldiers tried to sleep on the ground, yet their bodies trembled from shock rather than cold. thoughts drifted toward questions they never allowed themselves to consider during earlier campaigns. They remembered speeches from leaders promising decisive victories. They remembered posters depicting Germany as unshakable. None of it matched the present. Reality settled over them like a thick blanket, heavy enough to dull every thought. Some soldiers looked upward during quiet moments, watching aircraft cross the sky with steady formation lights. These flights continued through the night, delivering supplies to Allied troops pushing inland. The contrast was painful. Germany's supply lines had started to fracture, while the enemy strengthened theirs with precision. Soldiers listening to those engines overhead felt something inside them break. Hope that had survived earlier hardships now dissolved. Nothing could erase what they had seen across the beaches. Nothing could restore the certainty they once carried. By morning, every soldier who had witnessed the invasion understood that the war had shifted permanently. The coastline had not been defended. The enemy had landed successfully. Armoured columns rolled inland with purpose. Communications fractured. Confidence drained. No miracle would arrive to reverse what had begun. That realization settled into their bones, shaping every step they took during the retreat. D-Day had not simply opened a new front. It had revealed the truth Germany had been trying to hide from itself. Defeat had already taken root. This turning point carved a deeper silence into every retreating unit as they faced what could no longer be denied. Pressure from every direction demanded a reckoning far heavier than earlier losses. Further consequences waited within the thoughts of commanders who tried to make sense of a battlefield slipping from their grasp. High-ranking officers who had once spoken with unwavering certainty now faced a reality that unsettled even the most disciplined minds. Reports arriving from the coastline described a collapse far more severe than anything previously admitted within command circles. Maps filled with red markings spread across long tables, recording lost positions that had been expected to hold for weeks. Staff officers moved quietly through dimly lit rooms, layered with smoke drifting from oil lamps, carrying documents that delivered grim news. No voice rose above a murmur. Even those tasked with maintaining composure felt their confidence weaken as they analysed the widening gap between battlefield expectations and the actual state of the front. Rommel's injury struck the command structure with a force almost symbolic. His vehicle had been attacked during an aerial strike, leaving him severely wounded at a moment when his leadership was needed most. The absence of his voice created a void that no other officer could fill. He had argued repeatedly that the invasion must be repelled at the water's edge, believing delay would bring disaster. Many within the command dismissed his warnings earlier, choosing to trust in the strength of the Atlantic wall or the promise of armoured reserves held far from the coastline. Now those same officers stood over maps showing the consequences of their choices. Rommel's injury removed the last figure who might have argued for urgent adjustments. His silence spoke more sharply than any report. Within headquarters, tension grew as messages arrived from units retreating inland. Commanders saw entire divisions reduced to fragments. Regiments that had started the campaign with thousands of men now reported only a few hundred fit for duty. Communications between headquarters and frontline units broke repeatedly. Radio lines carried only static during crucial moments. Couriers arrived late due to bombardment along supply roads. Orders sent during the morning sometimes reached their destinations after conditions had already shifted. This breakdown created uncertainty that spread through the entire chain of command. Some generals responded by seeking explanations that protected their reputations. Discussions turned toward debates over responsibility rather than honest assessments of failure. Officers pointed to decisions made by their colleagues. They recalled earlier arguments about defensive strategy, using those disagreements as justification for their current positions. Blame moved quietly through the command network, settling on whoever appeared most vulnerable at that moment. These actions revealed an institution struggling to maintain unity under pressure. Cooperation weakened as individuals tried to distance themselves from consequences that were already unavoidable. Other officers attempted to review the broader strategic picture with clarity, yet even their efforts were shaped by pressure from above. Messages from Berlin demanded optimistic reports or reassurances that the situation remained manageable. Commanders who delivered honest assessments risked immediate removal. Several officers had already been replaced by figures considered more loyal or more willing to echo official expectations. Each replacement signalled a system unable to confront its own failures. Officers worked with increasing caution, knowing that a poorly phrased report could end their careers. As the coastline deteriorated, more detailed evaluations revealed that the failure extended far beyond tactical mistakes. Many within the High Command recognized structural weaknesses that had existed long before the invasion. Supply shortages, insufficient manpower, weakened air support, delayed reinforcements, flawed assumptions about Allied planning, and disagreements between senior commanders all contributed to the collapse. Yet few dared to acknowledge these factors openly. Admitting such truths risked personal consequences. Silence felt safer. Blame felt easier. Honest reflection disappeared beneath fear of punishment. In private quarters, some officers sat alone during the quiet hours before dawn. They studied worn maps that no longer matched the shifting front. Their hands rested heavily on polished desks littered with pencils, compasses, and scattered documents. Dust settled across the edges of maps left open for days. Outside their windows, the sky flickered with distant flashes from bombardment. These officers understood that the war had entered a stage where Germany lacked the capacity to reverse. Yet they also understood that no public admission could be made. Their faces carried an expression caught between duty and resignation. Tension within the command network intensified further as the retreat continued. Reports described units abandoning heavy equipment to escape pursuing forces. Bridges behind them were collapsing under artillery fire. Fuel reserves dwindled to levels that made coordinated movement nearly impossible. Each development forced officers to adjust their expectations downward. The hope for a counter-offensive faded. Defensive plans lost coherence. Meetings that once lasted hours now ended quickly because there was nothing left to propose that had any chance of success. Decision-making had become symbolic rather than practical. Some officers attempted to draft new lines of defence deeper inside France, yet even these plans felt temporary. They sensed that the collapse at Normandy had opened a path that could not be closed. They studied the trajectory of Allied movement and understood that any attempt to stabilise the front would require resources no longer available. This realisation settled slowly into their posture, reflected in slumped shoulders or eyes that avoided contact during briefings. Their silence told the truth their speeches avoided. The final layer of their private thoughts revealed something heavier than fear. It was recognition. They recognized that the war had crossed a threshold. They recognized that each decision they made from this point forward served only to delay what could not be prevented. They recognized that the weight of responsibility stretched far beyond the battlefield, touching the fates of millions. This recognition shaped every movement within those dim rooms, creating an atmosphere so heavy that even the quiet felt oppressive. These officers carried the burden of decisions made too late to alter the direction of the war. Pressure from collapsing fronts left them with truths they could no longer set aside. Deeper consequences waited for a nation beginning to face the cost of its strategic illusions. In the months that followed the invasion, the memory of D-Day settled into the German consciousness with a heaviness that touched every corner of the country. Soldiers who survived carried the weight of that morning through every train ride, every step onto rebuilding streets, every quiet moment when the sounds of the front faded. Yet the images remained sharp. Villages filled with families who had heard fragmented stories through letters, reports, or rumours, slowly pieced together an understanding of what had happened on the beaches of Normandy. That understanding brought a mixture of disbelief, sorrow, and quiet shame. Nothing about the invasion matched the confident expectations shaped during earlier years of the war. Instead, it had revealed a vulnerability that struck at the very core of national identity. Men returning from the front often avoided discussing the details. Their silence held more truth than descriptions ever could. They walked through familiar streets feeling disconnected from the surroundings that had once brought comfort. The sounds of daily life, children playing, carts rolling, and distant bells felt strangely out of place after the chaos they had experienced. Many kept their memories buried inside notebooks, letters never sent, or private thoughts carried through sleepless nights. The more they tried to forget, the more certain moments pushed themselves forward the explosions along the coastline, the overwhelming numbers of enemy troops, the collapse of positions believed to be indestructible. These fragments replayed themselves without warning. For civilians, the realization arrived with a mixture of shock and unease. Propaganda had shaped the invasion as something manageable, a temporary challenge, yet families recognized the truth as reports became impossible to obscure. Mothers noticed the exhaustion in their sons' faces when they returned. Wives recognized the strain in the way their husbands moved. Children saw the quiet tension in neighborhoods that once held confidence. The invasion had taken place miles away, yet its consequences reached into every home. The once strong image of the nation had cracked. Confidence in leadership weakened. Questions that had never been spoken aloud began to rise within private thoughts. As the war continued, the memory of D-Day grew heavier, not lighter. Each retreat across Europe tied itself back to the events of that morning. Soldiers fighting in the months that followed understood that the invasion had opened a path that Germany could not close. Every lost city, every collapsed defensive line, every destroyed convoy felt like an echo of the moment Allied troops stepped onto the beaches. That awareness carved a quiet sorrow into those who served. They realized that the war had shifted long before many of them understood it. D-Day became the symbolic turning point even for those who had not been present. The older generation felt the memory differently. Many had experienced the previous war, carrying wounds that never fully healed. They had watched Germany rise with promises of strength, order, and stability. They had believed that their sacrifices would not be repeated in another conflict. When news of the invasion spread, they recognized signs they had once known but hoped never to see again. The collapse of confidence, the strain on families, the fear in young soldiers' eyes. These images mirrored memories they had carried since the earlier war. This parallel brought a deeper sadness, one rooted in the feeling that history had circled back upon itself. Within the government, officials struggled to maintain a narrative that reassured the population. Reports minimized losses or rephrased failures as temporary setbacks. Yet even these efforts could not erase the growing awareness that the nation had been caught unprepared. The Atlantic Wall had not held. Reinforcements had failed to move with the necessary speed. Defensive plans had fractured under pressure. Every citizen who read between the lines understood that D-Day had exposed a level of miscalculation that damaged trust. Quiet conversations inside homes touched upon this realization with caution. People avoided speaking openly, yet the shared understanding hung in the air. As the war neared its end, the memory of D-Day transformed into something larger than a single military defeat. It became a lesson wrapped inside loss. It forced the nation to confront its own assumptions about strength, strategy, and destiny. Many who survived the conflict later described D-Day as the moment when confidence dissolved across an entire generation. Some spoke of it in diaries written long after the war, describing how the invasion shattered beliefs they had once held tightly. These writings carried a sense of regret, shaped by the thought that earlier warnings had been ignored or dismissed. For those born after the war, the memory of D-Day reached them through stories, photographs, or records that their families kept locked away for years. They listened to those accounts with a mixture of curiosity and melancholy. They learned that their country had once disregarded signs that later proved undeniable. They learned how pride had blinded leaders to strategic realities. They learned that lives had been lost not only through battle, but through failures of preparation, communication, and responsibility. These lessons passed quietly across generations, becoming part of the national fabric. Over time, the The beaches of Normandy turned into landscapes of remembrance. Visitors walked across sand that had once carried smoke, bodies, broken equipment, and footprints of men whose choices shaped the course of the century. Memorials rose across the cliffs, offering quiet places where families could stand beneath the open sky and reflect on the cost of war. German families visited these sites with emotions that blended sorrow, humility, and introspection. The memory of D-Day no longer belonged solely to those who had fought. It belonged to the entire nation, woven into the collective identity with a weight that encouraged reflection rather than pride. The legacy of that day grew with each passing decade. Teachers described it as a turning point in history classes. Historians analysed it through documents, maps, testimonies, and military studies. Families carried fragmented stories across kitchen tables. Children grew up understanding that D-Day represented more than an invasion. It represented the moment an entire nation confronted consequences shaped by its own decisions. This recognition continued to shape how Germany viewed itself in the years that followed. In the end, the memory of D-Day remained not as a tale of battlefield strategies, but as a reminder of vulnerability, responsibility, and the cost of neglecting truth. It marked the beginning of a long process through which the country rebuilt itself with a deeper awareness of its past. The echo of that morning, with its distant gunfire, collapsing bunkers, frightened soldiers, and shattered illusions, continued to guide reflections across generations long after the war had ended. This final memory settled into the national consciousness as a quiet reminder of everything lost during the invasion. Recognition of failure moved through the decades as families sought to understand the choices that shape their history. Further contemplation waited within the hearts of those who believed reflection could prevent future tragedy. Thank you for staying with this story until the end. May your night be peaceful. May your thoughts rest easily. May sleep arrive softly to carry you into calm dreams.